Good morning, everybody. Welcome. My name is Brenda Erdley. I am the president of the Montana Sex Offender Treatment Association. And we are very excited today to bring Dr. James Cantor from Toronto to speak to us here in Missoula. For those, anyone in the association knows, and now that you know, I have a huge crush on this man. I think, now you know. I know I'm not your type, but I mean,
I like your wardrobe.
thank you. Oh, all the things I can go with there, but I won't. So I do wish to thank Walla Walla University for being a sponsor for this program, as well as the University of Montana's Department of Counseling Education. They both offered support to us, as well as the Department of Corrections. Is there anything else I want to say? I don't want to cut into this gentleman's time. One thing I will say, when I've been emailing back and forth and harassing him obsessively, is that I just said, "Can you come talk?" And he said, I asked him if he'll come speak, and he said, "Sure, not a problem." And I said, "What do you want to talk about?" He said, "What do you want?" I said, "Whatever works for you." I said, "Can you talk for 6 hours?" He's like, "Oh yeah, not a problem." So I said, perfect, we're on. So I don't want to cut into any more of his time. He's an amazing gentleman. He's a clinical psychologist, sex behavior specialist, working in this field over 20 years, research, highly published, highly recognized internationally. We're just really blessed to have him here. So without much further ado, thank you for my anxious morning.
My pleasure. The pleasure's mine. And no matter how much I publish, my mother still calls me, "Hey, shithead." I grew up with those parents. Where'd you lose the point, stupid? Oh, and happy Star Wars Day to everybody. May the 4th be with you. Thank you. And thank you for the very kind introduction. I apologize in advance for every late email I sent.
There was a lot of them.
There was a lot of them. It's been a busy winter. Actually, today's the 4th. Today's, God, I'm disoriented. Tuesday was my last day at CAMH. I've just resigned from CAMH. I now call it DAMH. Well, I've for a long time called it DAMH. Over dinner, after a couple of glasses of wine, asked me for the inside stories. Anyway, so that was my last day. I'm now entirely private practice, but my hands are still going to stay well in science, mostly through collaborating with various other teams. And what I'm hoping for is to do more stuff like this, where I get to translate the science to everybody else, so we don't have to always be speaking, neuroanatomy baffled gaff, and can actually get the information out. One of the things that really just continues to stay with me, even though I'm not doing that much. This is off, isn't it? So I'm just projecting, yes? I can do that.
No, it's on. I think you need to
We like it. It's one of those really cool.
So it's working? So if I do this, that's when we start with Darth Vader. Darth Vader in this high-pitched Jewishy Darth Vaderwitz. Vader Baum, Vader Baum, I think. I'll figure it out. Where was I? Right, just leaving CAMH, right, keeping my hands in it, doing more stuff like this, to actually translate the information, from the laboratories where all 8 of us work on it, to where it can actually do good in the world. The other part is, now that I am healthily past 50, and I can just feel my IQ leaking out of my ears, I can't do the shit that I used to be able to do. I mean, we think about this with athletes, but we never think about it with cerebral kind of careers. By the time you hit 40, pick a sport, your days are behind you. You can't do what you did at 20-something. It's exactly the same for a scientist, except the scientists use such garbagey language that they can get away with doing it because nobody understood them anyway. So for, Act 2, although I didn't exactly intend it, really what I want to do is to start translating more of the sciences. Since I still speak the language, I just can't do the 16-hour days that it used to take in order to do this kind of science. Other 50-somethings? Sitting by the front where you can hear. I'm up to trifocals. Anyone? Anyone? Yeah. Now, given that it's been an uncomfortable amount of time since I got to start doing this kind of research, I now get the opportunity to kind of look back at it and see, see patterns that I didn't get to see before. When I just started, as a postdoc and even as an intern, I was doing what a lot of postdocs and interns kind of do: just look for something you can fucking publish. Just need something, I need to finish my dissertation. We pretend that it's our, great, question that we will. Just find a topic so you can graduate. I just really kind of got lucky that I ran into a topic with some real meat on its bones, and I got to stick with it for a while. And the best advantage to that is that that gives you the opportunity to answer some of the big questions as one tiny little experiment leads to a tiny little experiment. And each one seems like a one-off unimportant thing, but when you take a step back and look at the whole thing, you can really start, thinking about some of the stuff that we've all been wondering, but never really had the opportunity to address in a meaningful way. Especially with a topic like this one, which is so fraught with emotion, so fraught with politics and fear, that people kind of miss the big picture in view of the whatever most recent case just hit the newspapers. The one that just hit the newspapers actually is very close to home. The van attack in Toronto. It's Alec. Starts with an M. I don't remember the last name. No, this was a guy. He refers to himself vaguely as an incel. The people that collect on websites, they refer to themselves as the involuntarily celibate. So these are mainly heterosexual young men who are very frustrated that they're never dating and getting laid. They are holding the women responsible for this, where, most of the time I'm scratching my head. You're just being such an asshole that you're cock-blocking yourself. Be somebody dateable, maybe somebody will date you. That's the incel community. Actually, to be fair to them, there's only been a single survey, 15 years ago-ish, and it was a mix. It was a mix of young males with absolutely no social skills or even the insight to realize that their problem they are in complete control of, but instead they just kind of, blame everybody else. And often that's women, feminism, toxic masculinity, take your pick. Anyway, and so this guy, these people collect on billboards and, Reddit and those kinds of things, and really they just kind of push each other to further and further extremes. Because when there's nobody there, socially apt to say, dude, you're really pushing the envelope here, they're in an echo chamber. So extreme statements start sounding less extreme because everybody's saying the same thing. So if somebody out of this group of a couple thousand is a little bit close to the edge, this will be an issue that he picks, or if he's going to become violent, he will often blame this issue for his violence. And the mistake that the media are making is, we got to do something about this group. No. You need to do something about people who are psychiatrically unstable and get attracted to these groups. The great majority of these groups are politically uncomfortable. I want to contest their statements, but these groups are not causing the violence. They're just kind of being a draw for people who are, looking for a fight. And they just kind of give somebody a moral justification for that fight. Anyway, so that's what's going on with the incel gang. So for the big questions for this, when I got to start this 15 years ago-ish now, the big question then, and still, largely, is it in the brain at all? This is one of those questions where the running theory was always that the abused abuser hypothesis is what we call it. That somehow being a victim of childhood sexual abuse is what makes a person into a pedophile, into a sexual abuser. Kind of a like makes like idea. The problem with it is that there was a little bit of evidence kind of hinting towards that direction. And because it's so intuitive, whether you're, a psychoanalyst, whether you're a behaviorist or learning theorist, it kind of made sense, like makes like. That wasn't hard to believe. But if you look a little bit deeper in the research, that's not what the association is. It's chaotic childhood begets chaotic adulthood. It is true that people who are subjected to sexual abuse in childhood are more likely to commit sexual abuse in adulthood. However, people who are neglected in childhood are also more likely to commit sexual abuse in adulthood. People who suffer violent but non-sexual abuse in childhood are more likely to become sexual abusers in adulthood. It's any chaotic background, and it doesn't all lead to sexual abuse. Somebody who suffers any one of those could just as easily become a violent but non-sexual abuser, a neglectful parent rather than an abuser at all, or a sexual abuser. It's chaos begets or disinhibits chaos. It's not sex begets sex. But it's easy to have made that mistake. If you take a survey of sex offenders and ask how many were abused, you get an elevation. Aha! But nobody bothers asking about neglect or the other kinds of abuse. And when we're looking at the sex offenders, who are by definition sex offenders, but we don't ask the same questions of neglectful parents or violent non-sexual parents. If we ask the broader question, we would see that this is chaos begets chaos, not sex begets sex. Although, again, and I often repeat this, if one is only looking at the sex, you would find the correlation, but that's not the big picture. So because that's what everybody believed then, except a couple of us nerdy types who were looking generally, what in biology makes anybody into whatever it is that they're into. That's actually how I, openly gay, started. You know, I started with exactly the same kind of question that anybody else would. Why am I different from everybody else? Easily begets the question, why is anybody into whatever they're into? Although I originally, when I was young and pretty, again, why was I different from everybody else? And we were only in those days just starting to figure out what in the brain seems to produce at least male sexual orientation. Female sexual orientation, much more complicated. I do not understand women inside or out. That was a bit far of a joke even for me. 2, 3, 4. So when I just kind of had the opportunity, you know, working as an intern with Ray Blanchard and Howard Barbary at then CAMH was just formed that year, they were now doing research on what makes the pedophiles into what they're into instead of gay men and lesbians, you know, into men and women. So to me, this was just another facet of the same big picture question. Instead of looking only at what causes homosexuality versus heterosexuality, what causes pedophilia versus, we kind of invented a term. Ray Blanchard didn't like the word adultophilia because he, for reasons I do not understand, the man loves inventing new words. Well, he often, in sex research, runs into situations for which there is no word. So he produces one. He realized that adultophilia is part Latin and part Greek, and you're not supposed to do that. Whatever. So he said, well, so he looked up the Greek word for adult in order to develop the word teleophilia, which is the technically correct word now for adultophilia. Anyway, so in those days we were doing research on what makes gay men gay, and now we could expand that to what makes people into not just children, but again, the broader question. Remember gerontophiles? You know, now and then you'll read a story about the rape of an elderly woman. If he's a rapist and he's going to attack somebody at gunpoint, he's going to pick who he's most into. If he's picking a senior, he's into seniors, I'll bet. And what makes the age range? You know, humans are just into, you know, reproductive age is our favorite age. You know, late teens, early 20s to late 40s-ish, generously. After that, good luck. Okay, so as I say, so that really was the basis of my curiosity, is this in the brain in the same way that homosexuality, when we started this, was then just turning out to, we were finding evidence that it was in the brain. Now, unlike homosexuality, where, although we had a history of attempting conversion therapy, now unnecessary, basically, use condoms, have a good time. But now when we're talking with pedophiles, even if we have evidence or when we have evidence that it is in the brain, what do we do with that information? Can't say, have a couple of condoms, go have a good time. The only thing we can do is, treat it, convert it. Is there a conversion therapy for pedophilia? And now that, but we all naturally think, yes, there should be one. We need to work on one. We should be doing research in them. We should be testing them. But now this is generation 2. We're accustomed to the complete failure to develop a conversion therapy for homosexuality. There are the ethics questions about it, but the basic important part is that it failed despite a century of trying every psychological theory ever developed, from psychoanalysis through behaviorism and aversion therapy and so on, all the way through the modern era where now it's, well, either use condoms and have a good time, or you're sent to some religious conversion thing, you're kind of anointed, told you're cured, and then now you have a good note to show your wife, see, I'm cured, it's official. But with pedophilia, now we have, a pro-social, reasonable reason to want to try to convert them or to need to try to convert them to teleophiles. And when they come in, and if you do, come into the office, Doc, I got a problem. Yeah, no, they want to be converted. They do not want to be into kids. They know that they cannot express it, there's nothing they can do about it, and that they would rather not have this sex drive than a sex drive that they cannot express ever under any circumstances, zero tolerance for failure, with no help or support from anybody. Of course they want not to be pedophiles. I'll get more into it later, but of course we make it practically impossible for them to come in to get that help unless there's a victim. Mandatory reporting laws. Right, so, and even when we don't have to report, a lot of us are in the same boat. Even though we know we don't have to report, that doesn't mean the lawyers know we don't have to report. Just because we obeyed the law is not going to stop somebody with a civil lawsuit making a lot of trouble for any of us anyway. Sometimes the therapists don't even know if they don't see a lot of pedophiles or a lot of borderline cases where they get to work out the ambiguities. They will call just in case. You're protected if you call when you don't have to, but you're not protected if you don't call when you should have. Now, of course, the pedos know this. They discuss this, with each other when they can, on various listservs and billboards, so they just don't come in. So rather than having pedophiles out in society receiving whatever support, sex drive reducing medications, whatever's appropriate to the case, instead of creating that situation, we've created a situation where we have pedophiles circulating out in society completely unbeknownst to anybody. There, feel safer? But that's what we've done. In all of this, fast and furious, be bad to the bad guys, we're just making the situation worse out of blind panic. I was better off with the jokes than the down notes, I guess. So can we treat it? And therefore, what does the neuroscience tell us about the potential changeability of pedophilia? Is it in the genes? Again, one of the great big questions, and it ultimately gets back to the same kind of main question. A lot of people's motivation for asking, is it genetic, is really just kind of a way that people use to ask, can it be changed? Although it's incorrect, a lot of people still think if it's in the brain, it can't be changed. Although now and then people are starting to hear of neuroplasticity, so they're starting to make the opposite thing. Oh, if it's in the brain, therefore it can change. Took 2 years and all of a sudden everybody's saying the opposite. Whatever. But people still ask about the same thing about genes. Is it genetic? To a scientist, when you ask, is it genetic, that's a very specific question. DNA, specific molecules, specific Mendelian patterns, evolutionary questions, it means something very specific. But when most people use the word genetic, they're really asking a question about judgmentalism. Is it their fault, is really what the person is asking. Is it something they were born with and could not control? Even though most people don't, really know the biology enough to ask the very specific questions, that's really where most people are aiming. Is it their fault? Can it be changed? and what's my appropriate reaction to them. So really the genetic question is a lot like the neuroscience question, but really the motivation for the question is one about, again, I don't have a better word than judgmentalism, but really how to evaluate the culpability or responsibility that the person has. So were they born with it? To most people is a synonym for is it genetic? Does it run in families? Ambiguous question. Again, sometimes that's really a question or a way to get at the question, is it genetic? Which is how most people think. Now and then I run into somebody clever saying it runs in families because the abuse runs in families rather than it's the gene that runs in families. Are they responsible for it? Brains, DNA, whether they learned it, whether they acquired pedophilia because they themselves were abused. Again, scientifically, it's a very interesting question, but most people's curiosity is really one about the responsibility and the culpability that scientific conclusion brings to the case. Now, on one hand, that makes things absolutely fascinating to a scientist. We usually don't get, that much attention to the outcome of whatever issue. This pill versus that pill. Take 2 of these or 1 of those. Take this, you'll be healthier, but dead in 10 years. Whatever it is, something concrete. But when we're talking about, questions like this where we have, these kinds of weighty social policy, you take this person's kids away or not kinds of questions, all of a sudden we have the basic science, MRIs, computers, and, the machines going and doing what scientists always do, but somehow the answer carries a weight to it that very few scientific questions do. Personally, I find that fucking amazing. And can we prevent it? Again, basically a scientific question, but the social and political implications of that are stunning. Because even though, in this context, I'm talking about pedophilia, can we prevent it? Most people would very quickly say, this is something worth preventing. Okay. However, the implication of that is that we now pick and choose which sexual interest patterns we deem acceptable and which ones we do not. So far, we said gay, good. Pedo, bad. All right, we've got the 2 extremes down. And then as we work, to some of the more ambiguous ones, sexual sadism, BDSM, where do we draw the line? Would the brain show that people who are into healthy kink, are their brains different in the same way that an actual sexual sadist's brain is different? Or do they just differ in how they express their sexual interests? That will be for the next short New York Jew to start tackling. But that's where these questions end up, is that even though we have, we've gotten the extremes pretty much, we've made progress on the extremes where we can, I think, have an intelligent conversation about them, but we're not having yet the conversation about where are we going to draw the line. And when we're talking about prevention, I'm now not talking about a pedophile coming into my office saying, Doc, I want to change. Now again, to think the analogy, if I had 20 years ago, maybe a little more, gay man coming into my office saying, Doc, I want to change. My duty to the gay man is to help him not to want to change, but to help him embrace his natural sexual structure, use condoms, have a good time, and don't hang out in the same bar that I'm in so I don't have to worry about remembering not to hit on you. So with him, it's straightforward. The pedo, but what difference, what in the big question ethically, I'm now making a judgment. I'm not going to change you, but I am going to change you. So far, the evidence for changing either one of them is the same. The difference between it being acceptable to help one change but not the other, that's now my moral structure. When we were talking only about turning gay men and lesbians into straight men and women, it was relatively easy to see the care provider's judgmentalism, and she making an ethical or religious or moral decision for the other person. That was easy to recognize. How is it different when I'm doing that for pedophiles? Except that we kind of have a joint recognition that it makes sense that a pedophile would want not to be a pedophile. But what exactly, in basic, if we wrote out, here are our moral principles, which principle is it that would let me distinguish these 2 cases? They're both consenting. If I have a gay man, who said that? It was a great answer. Thank you. Yeah, she said consent is the difference between these two. Yes, let's continue with that. Now, if the gay man comes in wanting to change, he's consenting in a way. I mean, he's consenting in that he will sign the form, but we would often react, well, the reason that he wants to change is how society is treating him. It's really society that needs to change. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, well, yes. In what makes it, in consent makes, gay men and lesbians go have a great time, but, adults, children, the kid is not consenting. Thank you. I was thinking consent to the therapy. I don't think consent of the participant slash victim really makes the difference, because there are, for example, pedophiles who never touch a kid. They use text-based porn. No victim. Nothing wrong with it. No evidence that this turns somebody into a pedophile, although there are people who believe that. So do we ban it? There's nobody there to consent. But we can certainly understand that the person does not want a sexual interest pattern that they cannot express. So but both of those people would consent to the therapy, but with the gay man, we would say, really, you're not the one with the problem. We need to help you build up the stuff you need in order to tolerate a homophobic society. That's not an option with a pedophile and many of the other sexual atypicalities. But where did I get off the hook? I'm still making an ethical judgment about which one of these I should and can try to treat versus not. I don't have an answer for this. I just point out that that although we congratulate ourselves for our, ethical awareness to know that I shouldn't be bringing, the usual example is, my homophobic attitudes in order to try to convert the gay man, well, we've just flipped it. We're now using my pro-gay attitudes for me to make the decision to tell him not to convert. I'm just as judgmental, but I'm using the politically correct judgment. And we are all perfectly comfortable making exactly the same judgment for the pedophile. So how liberal are we, or are we just hypocritical? Now, the reason I like to give that blurb, and I'll return to our heavyweight tone. I can say this shit because I'm gay. I can play my, gay get out of, politically correctness jail free card. And if I start saying homosexuality and pedophilia in the same sentence, nobody's easily going to call me homophobic. For the whatever percentage of everybody here who's straight, try saying the same thing in front of an audience and come out of it without getting attacked politically. We can't even have the conversation. Right, so to me, I literally like using my pulpit, like using my literal pulpit to point this out, that although we're congratulating ourselves, if you actually write out the logic of what we're doing, have we made any progress, or are we just congratulating ourselves? Okay. So some people I understood, I got to watch iPedophile again last night. Thank you. Secret. The director called me back. They want me to do a series. Have I mentioned recently how much I wanted to leave CAMH? In fact, I want to do an anti-CAMH episode. As I said, I'll call it Damn Age. They want it to be like Cosmos, but for sex. Carl Sagan was a hero of mine. Right, I even bought an orange turtleneck just so I could do my Carl Sagan imitations. Indeed. I love having an audience closer to my age. Sorry for the tangent. So I was talking to one of my new staff psychologists. She's 30 if a day. I was in Minnesota. I was in Minnesota giving a talk 2 weeks ago. My partner came with me. I have a cousin, which is a long story, another long story over there. So they went to St. Olaf College. because my partner wanted a ball cap that said St. Olaf on it. Remember, St. Olaf was where, uh, uh, thank you, was. I love an audience my age. Right, but there actually is no place, but there is a St. Olaf University, so they went to the St. Olaf College. St. Olaf College, so he could buy the hat that says St. Olaf. What got me on this? Minnesota. What got me on Minnesota? St. Olaf intern, thank you. The intern was the connection, so over 50. So went in and we had, I had my hat with the St. Olaf and I asked, and I told her, did she know who the Friends of Dorothy were? Because Friends of Dorothy was an old gay slang term that gay men would use to refer to each other. So Friends of Dorothy Gale, get it, get it? And then there was another generation and then the younger gays said, no, Dorothy's Zbornak. So these are the gang my age, the rest of you. Okay, so got to see it again last night. Got to see it again last night. Thank you. So the director, brilliantly talented. So so far they've made the proposal. They've had the production company who has signed on, and now, again, I'm a scientist. I don't know how this works. So the production company has a slate that they propose. In this case, to Netflix is the gang they're bringing it to, and then Netflix says we want this one, and this one. Okay, so you got to watch it again last night. I also watched it on the way over here, and they did a beautiful job, and I'm thrilled how it's still standing up. They did really. So he was very talented. It got nominated. Did I tell you this? It was nominated for Best Documentary for the Canadian Screen Awards, kind of our Emmys. So again, stupid little New York Jew. I went into science because I can't sing. Otherwise, I would have. I was born. Well, I was born with a desire to do Broadway. Right? Yeah. Okay. Gay New York Jew had the thing for Broadway. Everybody surprised? Can't sing, no Broadway, so I got a PhD instead. But there I was. They did it, and I'm on a fucking red carpet. I don't know how I get to do some of the shit that I get to do. Okay. So what I would like to do today, because we now have a more substantial amount of time, is really walk more carefully through the science in order to catch what it really means and what it doesn't. As I said, and really the main purpose to my first slide is the basic idea where people come into these kinds of questions with, because so much seems to depend on it, or at least so much seems to follow from it. And of course, in short movies and even in regular 1 hour, full keynote lectures, we can only get so much of the detail. So what I like about full day things is that we can, get into the meat enough so one can see both the strengths and weaknesses of studies, rather than just, brain has neuroplasticity, therefore everything can change. The too short of a soundbite really to appreciate what's going on. Now, shrinks, psychologists, now shrinks in general, even the MDs don't like, even psychiatrists don't like the brain. They just like to pretend that they know it. So really what I want to start with is basically, how does an MRI work? This is one of those things where, people, especially now, we hear so many three-letter acronyms for each of these. MRI, fMRI, DTI, on and on and on and on. And they just kind of blah, 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 fluffy, blah, 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 fluffy, blah. How a dog hears the owner, it's just blah, 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 until name, or the word treat, or time for a walk, or, the usuals. Okay, so this is how I want to attack the brain. First, I want to go through just the basic vocabulary. Now, again, the vocabulary itself is not horrendous, but nobody really explains it terribly well, and if you don't do that, the whole thing gets lost. So with this, you should be able to then hear any talk about MRI and behavior and be able to basically follow it. We get to follow the history of the questions, how the questions have evolved, the ones that we've answered, ones that we've answered have turned out to have been mistaken and answered again. I also want to talk a little bit about philometry. partly because it is one of the centerpieces for how we were able to do this kind of research. And despite how often it's used in our field, most people don't know the fine points of it either. People tend to treat it with the accuracy of a blood test rather than, it's better than a guess, but not that much better than a guess. Or at least we have numbers to tell us exactly how much better than a guess. But we still have people like Paul Fedorov who just think that it's 100% accurate, and so if there's any change on the phallometric test, that was a change in the person's actual pedophilia rather than a change in the person has now learned how to manipulate the test, because he's a fool, not to mention Paul Fedorov's name. Much. He and I have a debate coming out where I rip him a couple of new ones. It'll be in the something sexual health forum, something. I'll send it around the ATSA listservs. Most of you are, I assume, are on the listserv. It'll get around, or Google my name and, fire-breathing dragon, and it'll have a picture of me, smiting the wicked Fedorov dragon. Okay, then I want to go over the basic kinds of brain scans, again, because they are so easily confused. For those of us, my friends in the 50 and up set, remember CTs? Right, remember when they were the big, nobody even remembers what CT stands for. Anyone? Anyone? Good, yes, computerized tomography. So again, CT, PET versus MRI, MRI versus fMRI confuses a lot of people. We'll go through those. And how we analyze each of these things statistically. Again, because it's treated like it's magic. People just kind of, here are our two subject crews, and then a miracle occurs, and then you get these gorgeous graphs with bright colored things in the brain spinning around looking very fancy. But nobody actually explains how the statistics work, which is what makes it so easy for neuroscientists to pull shit over our eyes. I shouldn't say the neuroscientists. It's really more the media reports that kind of take some possibility out of it, present it as a conclusion, but don't really present the gray and the maybes and the this is really how statistics work, because everything we know about basic statistics still works for MRI statistics. Remember t-tests, and you can only do so many t-tests, otherwise you're just it's like rolling the dice until you get the number you want. Same problem exists when you're analyzing the brain. Nothing has changed. It's just that because there are so many t-tests going on in the brain, people just kind of check out and forget that, no, you still have to correct for running 1.2 million t-tests in the brain. The basics that we know are still true. Anyway, so I want to cover that. Then we'll actually cover, then we get to cover the actual results of the actual studies, including now the roughly half dozen studies that have come out after iPedophile. And that will in turn get us to answer some of the questions that we didn't have then, those beyond brain structure. And then we will be able to get, the entire big picture of where we are now. Count that? Oh, right. So first, the vocabulary. For people who toot, it's an old slide. Does anybody vlog anymore? Video log. Yeah, it's like a blog, but they, rather than write it out, who writes? They just stare at the camera, stoned, say whatever comes off the top of their head, and complain that they don't get laid. Oh. You can also tell that the slide is old because I said people over 40 instead of 50. Okay. Pedophilia proper, right, if I can say that. Now, of course, with this audience, I don't have to drive it home, but with every other audience I do, and I recommend to each of you, if you ever get the chance to give a soundbite to any audience, any media outlet, this is the soundbite. Pedophilia is not a synonym for child molestation. That is the great, big mistake that society makes over and over again, is they treat these like synonyms. Somebody was convicted of pedophilia. Somebody was diagnosed with molestation. mix these words up and treat them as synonyms over and over again. Now, it's not just the vocabulary difference. People think that these phenomena are synonyms when they're not. Again, this is the last audience I have to tell this to, but pedophilia is the sexual attraction pattern itself, whereas child molestation is the expression of that pedophilia. It's the actual touching, victimizing of a child. There are child molesters who actually prefer adults over children. Incest situations, of course, are the most common that that's in. They're using the kid as a surrogate, even though they prefer adults as sexual partners. Flip side, there are also pedophiles who never act on it. They appreciate the nature of their sexual interest pattern, they know that it can harm the kid, and they essentially swear themselves to a life of celibacy. One of the big groups that I'm always sending people to, the VERPEDs, the virtuous pedophiles. Another, right, if I get 2 sound bites, they're the second sound bite. These are men, I think entirely, who recognize that they are sexually interested in children, and they support each other in the, dude, you're not the only one, and they just commiserate over its difficulties, be able to share stuff with the only other people on the planet who could possibly understand them, and at the same time remain anonymous as they support each other in remaining offense-free. I send people there regularly. Since iPedophile came out and the other research came out, as you might guess, I get emails all the time from these people. Where can they go? Who can they see? They can't see a therapist. Sometimes they're married and they can't tell their wives. They don't feel comfortable going to any. What are these people supposed to do? And they often end up emailing me out of pure desperation. There's one I got last month. He signed his email simply as Father of George. His name was John, in parentheses, wrote Father of George. His son, George, committed suicide. And in his note, the kid's note, he told his father he was a pedophile and had watched iPedophile. And so the father was emailing me to try to help understand what his son must have been going through. I cried. I sent the letter to the virtuous pedophiles. They cried. I eventually, who else could I send him to? I sent Father of George to the virtuous pedophiles. Who better to tell him what it must have been like when they were kids? I'm just guessing and relating stories. And I haven't heard back since. I don't know if they're still in communication. But that's the kind of stuff that we can help either via prevention, treatment, and sometimes just sitting and nodding. I know it's tough. You know, sometimes they just need an hour once a week to just de-stress, debrief with the one person they can tell. Okay, so there are the child molesters. I have them in that hand. I have the child molesters and the pedophiles. Of course, there is overlap, and they're the ones we really we need to deal with, but they also exist independently. One of the great mistakes that so much research has made was to fail to account for the distinction between these two. Most of the research that we do is done in a forensic setting, not surprisingly. So these are pedophiles, largely, who have committed child molestation. That's how they got into our sample. So when we study them, is the result that we came out with because they are pedophiles or because they are willing to break the law? They're a little bit antisocial. Study after study after study after study has forgotten or failed to distinguish those two and ended up saying, here are some characteristics of pedophiles when they're not characteristics of pedophiles. They're characteristics of criminality. It's just that the criminals you happen to be examining are the child molestation, so it looks like it's produced by pedophilia, but actually what it is criminality. Okay, so that not all child molesters are pedophiles, not all pedophiles are not child molesters, behavior versus attraction. Oh, and the definitions that we use follow according to a person's primary attraction. I also get a lot of clients and regular everyday psychotherapy clients, and one with a sliver, doc, I think I'm a pedophile. He's not. Regular everyday gay guy, he just has, you know, some half memory of him regular child play when he was a kid with his brother, but he has OCD. He's afraid he actually molested his brother, and he's now forgotten. Now, how do you tell somebody that they're not I can send him for a phallometric test, but this guy got lucky. Of all the people on the planet he ends up with as a therapist, the one who can say, "You're gay, not a pedo." So somehow, I got away with being able to say, "No, you're not a pedo," and it carries heavier weight from me than when most shrinks say it. And most shrinks don't have the confidence to be able to, "Dude, no, you're just a homo. Have fun. Here are the condoms." Now, once we got over that part, it was fine. Now we had to deal with his OCD. Pure coincidence. My husband treats OCD patients in the office on the other side of the same wall. Do I have a referral from you for you? It turned out, actually, it felt kind of funny to refer somebody to my own partner. There's a certain conflict of interest-y thing to it. Now, the client loved the idea. Well, first, gay couples, so, he's single, so the idea of having a older gay couple kind of as role models is its own, and to have the pair, each of which happened to have expertise in exactly what he needed. He doesn't even have to learn to go to a new office. Okay, so primary sexual attraction. So even if this guy did have the occasional sliver of an attraction for the occasional kid, we would not diagnose that as pedophilia. It is perfectly typical. I hate using the word normal. It's perfectly typical for somebody to have the occasional sexual fantasy outside of their usual thing. A straight guy will have the occasional fantasy about another man, about a penis, about a she-male, something unusual. A guy who's into adults will have the occasional young person, bizarre half-remembered fantasy about a kid. So it's really about peak, and then everything else is less important. So it's not, so it's not hot, not, it's hottest, close, little less close, after a couple of drinks maybe. You have your favorite, and then... So it's the same with them. So there are adultophiles with the occasional fantasy about a kid. Generally, I would not diagnose that, although I could certainly understand why the person would be distressed by it. It could be healthy distress, what the hell does this mean? Or it could be unhealthy distress, OCD or some other kind of irrational anxiety. There are also people, we'll get more on that later, who are attracted to different age ranges, and we might call them hebophiles instead of pedophiles and so on. There will be people who have, say, half their fantasies are about adults and half kids. Now we're starting to dance a little bit. How much trouble does this cause? Is he going to act on it? How much distress does it cause him? And then we have the ones who are more attracted to children than they are to adults, or they're attracted to a larger proportion of children than the proportion of adults. Those we would much more straightforwardly diagnose officially. Emphasize that. Again, for the age ranges. Pedophilia, again, the legal world is trying to blur the legal world. The defense world is trying to blur this line a little bit. Now, because in the U.S., and I'm American, so I get to make fun of gays because I get to play my get out of gay jail free card. I'm a dual citizen, so I feel like I also deserve, I get to make fun of the politics down here. What color state is this?
Really red.
Mizzou is blue.
Like you're in a blue costume.
I think I might be in a blue room. Well, campus in general. You're getting educated? Blue. Oh, I can get worse. You can spell the word educated? Blue. You can spell the word blue? Blue. Okay. In the defense world and down here, the SVP legislation, right, my Canadian starts to leak out. The SVP legislation down here. Now, of course, that the way that folks, the legal folk, twisted those to be constitutional would be, oh, this isn't double jeopardy, even though it's fucking identical to double jeopardy. We'll just say that it's because of your pedophilia instead of your child molestation will now be the reason that we're institutionalizing you. Even though we know only a small fraction will ever commit another offense, that treatment is cheaper, yada, yada, and again, you're the last people I have to tell the arguments to. However, one of the side effects of that, nonsensical, in fact, making things worse kind of legislation, the sexually violent predator stuff, is that it now makes much more important who counts as a pedophile and who does not. When it was incarceration, it's you did the act or did not. That's, I'll call it straightforward. Now, when one of these people then released, served their time, did their 300-year sentence only because, nobody thought of making a 400-year sentence. Now they're being released, whether they get pulled back and institutionalized, this time in a hospital for treatment for which we know there is no treatment until they're cured of this incurable disease. So now, because so much is hanging on whether they qualify for the diagnosis or not, now all of a sudden the line that we draw for who qualifies for a diagnosis, now all of a sudden it has an enormous amount of weight. Now, even though people will reflexively say, don't treat the DSM as a Bible, they will say, do not treat the holy DSM as a Bible. Blessed be it. And they will proceed to continue to treat it like a Bible. It drives me bats. Now, although the DSM authors, each one dumber than the next, with, I'll say, 6 exceptions, even though they want this to be a book based on science, they just start with the science and then they give it to a committee. Remember all the old jokes about a committee? What was it? What's a horse designed by? Something is a horse designed by a committee. What was it? A camel is a horse. Thank you. A camel is a horse designed by a committee. And the DSM is a committee of committees. And it goes up at... The DSM is not a science manual. For example, you can't give a diagnosis of, let's say, pedophilia till age 18. So at 17 and a half, your brain was one way. At 18 and a half, your brain is another way? No, there was nothing about age 18 that has anything to do with the diagnosis. That's a complete legal purpose. So when people say it's in the DSM versus not, it's, well, no, being in the DSM versus not is whether the insurance company has to fucking pay for it. That's what the DSM is. It's also used, as I say, in legal purposes. You were either subject to SVP legislation or not. That's what follows the DSM, not because it's right, but because it's the only book everybody knows. Whether you actually have a disease or not depends on the science. Without the add you have to be 18, add whether or not the insurance company has to pay for it, and on and on and on. I haven't even gotten to Big Pharma yet. Because who, qualifies for depression versus manic depression? Big Pharma wants, the more people who are diagnosed, the more people who get the pill. If you're an insurance company, you want fewer people diagnosed because those are fewer people that you have to pay for. And what's in the DSM is, of course, a committee's compromise. But we're treating it like it's the science. So for pedophilia, once SVP stuff came into full force, now whether you are under SVP is whether you count as this diagnosis. So all of a sudden, before when it was, guy coming into an office, doc, I think I have a problem, I'm into, pick your age range, and the doc starts, okay, let's talk about it. Sex drive reducing medications, self-control mechanisms, or just saying, you're into 16-year-olds, a little young chicken hawk, but, be careful, have a good time, find a young-looking 18-year-old just in case. But when this is, the rest of your life is in jail or not, all of a sudden, we have both sides. People who want the definition to be as high as possible because they want to incarcerate everybody, red states. And we have people who want as few people diagnosed as possible. They're paid for, they're defense experts. They want, the definition as strict as possible, so as few people get caught up in it. I understand each of their motivations. Each of their motivations is perfectly logical, neither of which has anything to do with science. But that's where all the thought is, and that's where all the decision-making is. A side effect of all of this and our definition of pedophilia is that now the term pedophilia is starting to get blurred or at least misrepresented by the people on one side or the other side who want more versus fewer diagnoses. To a scientist, to scientists today, we want to use, generally want to use as precise a definition as possible, because that way I can best interpret my results. This goes with this and not that. This goes with the center of it, not the outer edges, or vice versa. So we tend to want to use as precise and narrow definitions as possible. The original definition of pedophilia, when I say original, I mean 1886 by Kraft von Ebing, said pedophilia was the attraction to prepubescent children. That was his cutoff. Well, he said it in 1886, when puberty was 14-ish. Now, however, puberty's kicking in. 10 is pretty typical. You know, for a lot of girls, 9 is not at all unusual. Age of fertility has not changed. The completion of puberty has not changed. The beginning of puberty has. There are people who say that they're attracted to the prepubescent kid, under 10 years. No body hair, no evidence of maturation. Genitals are prepubescent size. They are children by every stimulus we can look at them. Pedophilia. The relatively in-between stage are pubescent age children, not adolescent, which is, again, people who want to argue against the existence of hebephilia say, oh, everybody's attracted to adolescence. We're not talking adolescence. We're talking pubescence. Adolescence goes up to, you know, late teens, sometimes even early 20s. Puberty is 11 to 14. If you're into 11 to 14-year-olds who generally cannot reproduce, generally cannot get pregnant, are not sperms, 12, 13 is a little ambiguous. Girls cannot get pregnant generally until after 14. Puberty starts earlier, but its completion is still pretty much the same as it always was. That's why we're taller today. We spend most of you spend more time in that growing phase because puberty starts earlier, even though it ends at pretty much the same age. Okay, so in science, we are now using a more restrictive definition of pedophilia. Instead of, you know, children in general, we're now saying prepubescent children, which on average is up to about age 10. And for the people who are attracted to pubescent age kids, again, on average 11 to 14-ish, we're calling that hebephilia. Now, to the defense people, oh, no, my client's not a pedophile, he's a hebephile. See, he's not a pedophile, he's not subject to the SVP. All right, now I'm twisted. Actually, everything we know, and I'll show this later, everything we know in the brain that's true of pedophiles is true of hebephilia. There is no difference between pedophilia and hebephilia. These are differences in kind or extremeness. It's the others, there's a group in between here. There's a group in between the pedophiles and the teleophiles. We sometimes call them ephebophiles, which means attraction to youth. You know, 15, 16-ish. Again, the chicken hawks. So there's this enormous debate going on over the existence of hebephilia. Although it's often being, you know, posited or described as a science versus non-science debate, or this is really a prosecutor versus defense debate, where the defense people want as narrow a possible definition because that's what their clients need, where the prosecutors want the broader definition. The science goes with a broader definition. For better or for worse, the science seemed to suggest everything that is true about pedophiles is also true about the hebephiles. There's no difference between them except extent. The distinctions are, the line seems to be between hebephilia and everything else. As I say, teleophilia is the attraction to adults while we're on vocabulary, and now my past 50 days, of course, I'm all of a sudden wondering if I should start doing research in gerontophilia. Oh, there's another word sometimes you'll see around. Because pedophilia goes with hebephilia, and the original pedophilia was the broader definition, some people run them together and say pedohebephilia to mean attraction to children in general, 14 and under. Anyone want to guess who used the long, ugly word? Ray Blanchard. Oh, here's one other one. People who are attracted to she-males. A she-male is essentially an incomplete transitioned male to female transsexual. So they would look completely female. Large breast, curvy, they look beautifully female, but they have a penis still and intend to keep it in general. People who are attracted to that form, who are attracted to the she-males, Ray Blanchard wanted a word for that. He didn't like she-malophilic. I went back to the ancient Greek. Gynandromorphophilic. Gyne, like gynecology. Andro, like android, actually, male. Morph, form, philia. You're into it. Gynandromorphophilia. Into, right, male-female form. Makes perfect sense. I don't think it'll quite fit on a... Oh, and then, of course, everything has to have an abbreviation. A graduate student did a survey on them. He called them GAMPs, G-A-M-P, gynandromorphophilia. So now we call them GAMPs. Sex offending in the brain. Well, it's been a century. What are you expecting? I promise the 20th century will go fast. 19th century. Okay, now, as I say, 1886, and that really was the founding of modern sexology with the book that was written by von Krafft-Ebing, Psychopathia Sexualis. He was a forensic psychiatrist in Victorian England, and he was in charge of the crazies of the asylum in the days when the asylums were crazy asylums. And his specialty was in the sexual atypicalities. And in those days, that included everything from plain vanilla, what we would now call plain vanilla homosexuality, through all the sex offenses, through stuff for which we are still coming up with new names. And that is, somehow every lecture starts with old white man. I guess I have to watch that joke now that I'm becoming one. But as I say, the book itself is really the founding of modern sexology. He was the first person, he attempted to, using the scientific principles identified in the day, to figure out what was going on with these people, what made them different, what things went with what things, and he would describe case after case after case of unusual behavior. Each of these behaviors unusual in different ways, and he would do his best to cluster them, to see some kind of a pattern in the people that he was seeing over the years. Ultimately, he came down to the conclusion that here we are, well over 100 years later. Yeah, no, fucked in the brain. It's just that he didn't have CTs and PET scans or even neuropsychological tests. We were still a good 50 years from IQ testing. But his basic idea way in the beginning was that the sexual atypicalities were something in the brain. Now, he said that at the same time Freud said the sexual atypicalities and the other atypicalities are due to these ancient Greek myths. Id, ego, superego, and just whatever obtuse references he could make that sounded really smart, for which there was no evidence, but it was popular in Victorian England, so it was popular. He was dead wrong. But everybody knows who Freud is, and nobody's heard of this guy. My present company accepted. Right, go to ask most people who's Krafft-Ebing, and they will say, did he invent mac and cheese? So he didn't have MRIs, he didn't have the brain scans, he didn't have the technology really to pursue the question. And there were, for many, many years, as I say, the CT scans and so on were not available for almost 100 years, after. What we did have, however, over most of the 20th century is IQ testing. Now, again, to me, IQ is kind of like the blood pressure of the brain. It gives you an idea of the basic overall health. Although I won't always know anything going on with a particular person, but if I have a regular, everyday, person able to function, car accident, I can give another IQ test and find differences or patterns of strengths and weaknesses. So what I was able to do, because after World War II, after World War II and after the Kinsey studies, The thing to do was to collect as much data as possible on as many people as you could. Now, as I say, that's what Kinsey was famous for. Interview after interview after interview, thousands of people until he just put them together and tried describing them as a group. Now, even though we think of Kinsey as modern, he's never heard of representative sampling. The people who took the tests are the people who were willing to take the test. There is no reason to think it is at all representative. He went to universities and just took everybody he could who would volunteer at the university, and or in the 60s during the second volume. Whatever data he would gather about homosexuality were just the people who, in the 50s, were willing to admit and acknowledge their homosexuality. And so these are not representative samples. They were just large samples, but still unrepresentative. But that was the pattern. That's how science was accepted to be done, how social science was accepted to be done in the 50s. Still 100 years behind, the physical sciences. But what we did have after all of that IQ testing is we had these very large samples of not at all random people, but those that were the data that were collected inside forensic institutions. Oh, well, now this is representative of people in the forensic institution. I can't make any claims of this being typical for people who never committed a crime or who never got caught or who didn't get convicted, money, lawyers, whatever. But it's representative of the people it's representative of. So now I get to do things like compare the offenders against children with the offenders against adults. That solves the problem I had before. Now I'm comparing offenders to offenders. These will have a large proportion of pedophiles. They offended against children. These will have practically no pedophiles. They offended against adults. And when I compare them together, offense status is no different. Got caught is no different. Couldn't afford a good lawyer is no different. The only thing different is they picked children, they picked adults. So even though I have two non-representative samples, I get a perfectly representative comparison. Ain't that hot? However, the reason I like to point it out is that it's a subtle point that most people miss. The pedophilic community itself, if I can say there is such a thing, I'll say that there are two pedophile communities. From where I sit, which is one of the most bizarre seats on the planet, there are two groups of pedophiles. From my point of view, there are two groups of pedophiles, and I divide them into those that love me and those that hate me. It's kind of dumbfounding to think, what pedophile could possibly hate the one goddamn scientist on the planet who would give them the time of day and say, yeah, I got your back, I understand? It's because I said they have low IQs. It's a narcissistic injury. They're insulted. I will call them the bad guys. They hated me first, so it's fair. They believe, they express, I don't know how genuine it is, they often express the belief that it is the rest of us who are getting in the way of the natural, healthy love that they have for children and that there are children who have for them. They believe that. They believe that we are standing in the way of their Romeo and Juliet situations. So they hate me because they think I am saying low IQ, brain damaged, and they think I'm saying, therefore, we need to shoot them all. Not what I'm saying, but okay, you're just crazy and a pedophile. And then, the virtuous pedophiles are the ones who know what's going up, and they see me through my own eyes. Can I say that? I see, the way they describe me is how I see myself. As a scientist, you didn't ask for this, you're not to blame, you can't say it out loud. I have this bizarre seat that I have, and I am happy to give as good information to the world as possible. They are the people who, they are one of the groups of people who will benefit by it, and I am absolutely delighted to do it. So I have these two groups. The evil group hates me, and it started with my saying because the average IQ is lower. They hate me. There was something in between the hate and the IQ. Oh, it'll come back. Okay. So, they think that my science is mistaken. The bad guys, the ones who hate me, think that my science is mistaken Their argument being that I only looked at pedophiles who were caught, that's why they look stupid. I will give them half Psych 101 research methods. I can understand why they would say, I don't have a representative sample. I don't. Therefore, I can't say, their conclusion is, therefore, I can't say anything about pedophiles. Now they've missed the subtle science. My comparison group were also incarcerated, so it falls out of the equation. So this group often mistake my science as invalid, thinking that I compared pedos who were incarcerated to regular everyday healthy controls, which is not what I did. Other scientists did, not this one. Anyway, so I point that out only because it is easy to imagine somebody saying that, oh, but this isn't a representative sample, therefore it's not true. We can deal with that. It's not a 100% guarantee, but it's not the situation, it's not the simple 101 situation that a lot of people believe it is. Okay, so over the course of the 20th century, as I say, there were many institutions that were just collecting IQ tests and other data about everybody in the institution. That's what was done in those days. Masters and Johnson, same thing. They interviewed as many people as they could. These days, we would call that qualitative research. Not attempting to be representative, but get as broad a sample as you possibly can in order to see the diversity of potential responses. And then it would be the next study to say how many people want this, how many people want this, and then get the actual numbers out of a representative sample. But the early research, just get as many as you can and as far apart from each other as you can. That can give you an idea of the breadth. That's legit. Okay. So when I was starting to collect my own IQ data from my own sample, which takes a while, but it gave me time to, in those days we had libraries. Remember paper? We used to collect large amounts of paper and put it on shelves. And in those days, books, we called them books. They were vertical instead of piles that are horizontal. Turns out that over that time, there were 75 different studies that had samples of offenders against children that I could then use as examples to see if there's a pattern. Now, my first thought was there's going to be some kind of difference in the pattern of strengths and weaknesses that pedophiles have relative to non-pedophiles. And the first test of that, as I say, is IQ. So there were 75 such studies, and many of them, just like I was doing, offenders against children, offenders against adults, violent but non-sexual offenders, property offenders, and so on. So I got to compare each of them with a total of over 25,000 cases. So it was very, very large. But again, I'm not pretending that this is representative, but I'm comparing groups to groups. So over here I have the offenders against children, not all of whom do I expect to be genuine pedophiles. They're offenders against children. They will include some incest offenders, depending on the study. Others didn't. But I can bet that a chunk of them will be pedophiles, but there will be no chunk of the, practically no chunk of the offenders against adults who will be. And I get to compare them, again, to the non-sexual offenders. So their offenses were property offenses, violent but non-sexual. Non-offenders who were available, and then, you know, some reports just didn't give a good description. Now, just for comparison purposes, mean IQ is, by definition, 100. And then a standard deviation is 15. So somebody with an IQ of 115 is one standard deviation above the mean. Somebody with an IQ of 85 is one standard deviation below the mean. And this is what I got. So the non-sexual offenders, normal, 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 normal. The offenders against adults, a little bit lower, and the offenders against children, the lowest. So far, so good. Again, I can't necessarily make the big dramatic conclusions, but it's certainly the first clue. And then I got to do something else. This is one of those, you know, middle of the night idea hits you, kind of run downstairs before I forget it, and remember that I didn't get up to pee. Not every study used the same definition of children when they said sex offenders against children. Some had sex offenders against children under 18. Some were sex offenders against children under 16, under 14, under 12. So all I did is line up the mean IQ of the sample with their definition of child. And the younger their definition of child, the lower the mean IQ of the sample. Can't be an accident. I had nothing to do with any of these studies. These studies were conducted over the course of almost 100 years with 25,000 people. The younger the victims on average, the lower the IQ on average. I don't care if they find it insulting. Find another way to explain these findings. So we're up to 2000. Not bad for a century and a half. Have we, what time's the break? Perfect. Perfect. Okay, great. See you back in a couple minutes. Okay, so the IQ gets us up to roughly the year 2000. Now, which was the year really that I started. Now, at that time, there were two different ideas going about where in the brain. Yep. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. My announcement. I just wanted to say I'm making these slides available. I'll circulate a link from which you can download them. Normally, I would email them, but the whole file is about 20 megs, so you have to click a link in order to get them. My pleasure. Thank you for reminding me. Right around 2000, there were, in those days, still two sets of theories about where we thought things in the brain might be. Now, in 2000, this was still the early days of MRI. We could get decent pictures, but if we were going to see something in the brain, it had to be something relatively large. Looking at things in MRIs and with sample sizes, one of my favorite analogies for that is to think of it as like a telescope. The bigger the telescope, the further away you can see something, or a microscope. The more powerful the microscope, the smaller thing you could see. Early MRIs weren't as powerful. We could see the brain, but we could only see the relatively large things. And then as MRIs advanced, we got more and more powerful magnets and could see more details. Now, early in the 20th century, just at the beginning of the 21st century, we had even though we didn't have the super advanced MRIs yet, we did have neuropsychological testing. Remember that? A lot like IQ testing, but we would also be able to test the other functions of the brain. Vision, memory, attention, focus, those kinds of things. And by then, we had already known, the brain areas specialize. There are different areas that respond to vision, that respond to motor control, hormonal control, social interactions. Different parts of the brain control different basic functions. No surprise, but we wanted to know where in the brain pedophiles might be different. Once the IQ said, basically they're different on average, but we wanted to know then, of course, more precisely. So then the questions were, if it's in the parts of the brain that do this, the parts of the brain that do that. And what everybody was expecting in those days were either a difference in the frontal lobes or in the temporal lobes. The frontal lobes, his nose would be about here and looking that way. So you're looking at the left side of his brain. And so people thought that it would be roughly in the front, in this kind of area up here. Now, the reason that people thought that was that the frontal lobes of the brain is kind of where self-control is. That's where inhibition is. That's where disinhibition is. There was a famous case, Phineas Gage. Remember, he was the one where he was a railroad worker. He hammered something, and a steel iron, there was a dynamite underneath it. They were blasting through whatever, and the steel rod went in one side, out the other. And he survived. Again, this is very early medical technology. That he survived was by itself amazing. Even more amazing, really did not change many of his abilities. Memory functioned, IQ functioned as best as they could measure it. Everything kind of worked. This was not a profoundly brain damaged looking kind of guy, except outbursts. He could no longer control himself so easily. That was one of the first signs that it's this front part of the brain that handles the executive functions: organization, self-control, inhibition, and disinhibition if it's damaged. The other theorists were whom I nicknamed the temporal lobe theorists, kind of here behind where the ear is. Now, although I'm calling it temporal lobe, It's really, the relevant part is underneath, deep inside the temporal lobe where the limbic system is. Remember the lizard brain, the 4 Fs? Flee, fight, feed, and sex? I guess I blocked my own joke because I've already said fuck so many times. It's bizarre all of a sudden to get shy about it. So there were people who thought that the problem would be in the temporal lobes because that's where the 4 Fs were, and since pedophilia is one of the Fs, that was the basic idea. Now, I was kind of agnostic. I really had no particular prediction for where it would be, except I thought the frontal lobe theorists were nuts. I mean, they're basically saying, oh, pedophilia's got to be in the frontal lobes because, these people are unable to inhibit their sexual interests in children. And so I say, okay, how many people, are having trouble suppressing their sexual interests in children? Someone would look at you like you have 3 heads. What sexual interests in children? There's nothing to inhibit. So to me, the idea that pedophilia was a disinhibition just made no sense. There's nothing to come out if you get rid of the ability to suppress. So that made no sense to me whatsoever. So if I had a bias, it would be towards, one of the limbic system-y 4Fs kind of thing. But neuropsych tests aren't so hot on picking up the 4Fs in the limbic system, except for memory, which is controlled in the limbic system. So I was pretty agnostic at the beginning. Now, the way that we were able to test that before the super advanced MRIs came online, and I will add the expensive MRIs came online, was neuropsychological batteries. And there were a large number of studies done by one of my predecessors at CAMH. Ron Langevin did many of these. Same situation I was in. Many pedophiles were coming through our lab, and these people got a full battery of tests, including phallometric testing. In the early days, in the 70s and 80s, neuropsych testing was done with fixed batteries. Same way with an IQ test, where like the WACE is a standard set of 10, 12 different subtests of fixed different tasks meant to tackle the entire range of abilities that the brain has. That was the idea. There were 2 such batteries in existence in those days, the Halstead-Raytan battery and the Luria, Nebraska battery, just named after their inventors and where they were. And these were the same kinds of tests that I'm describing, memory tests, vision tests, interpretation tests, and so on, to see if they could find some pattern of relative strengths and weaknesses that the pedophiles would have that would in turn tell us to infer that there is therefore something right or not right with the part of the brain that controls that function. So Ron Langevin did about 15 years worth of these studies, found nothing. There were, like the IQ tests, there were, subtle signs of basic lower functioning, but nothing that said this part of the brain versus that part of the brain, or this kind of inability versus that kind of inability. So really no particular advance, although he claimed a great many advances in these papers. Funny story. These were not good papers. And I remember just doing the, man, how did this get published? And then I found out a lot of them didn't get published. They were junky papers. He had to create his own journal in order to publish them. The journal continues to exist today. After he stopped having papers he needed to publish, he essentially gave away the journal, which continues to exist today. The journal now, however, is actually a very good journal. Sexual abuse. It's now the ATSA journal, and that's how it started. It started from these really less than meek beginnings, and has since he left it, has become actually an important outlet. Okay. So those standardized batteries, or the early standardized batteries, really didn't tell us all that much. Even the batteries themselves are relatively primitive and are not widely used today, I think, except in Russia. What now tends to be the way that neuropsychology is done is to customize individual batteries according to whatever brings an individual client in. So if somebody comes in with a memory problem, you jump right to the memory tests and then other things that are related to memory, rather than test every single thing that's available, most of which will be irrelevant to the client and the client's particular symptoms. So nowadays, people are testing with individual neuropsychological tests, such as the trail-making test. That's one. It's relatively simple. It's actually a very effective frontal lobe test, where the person has, simple page with letters and numbers. Connect the A to the 1, to the B, to the 2, to the C, and go back and forth and back and forth. People with different kinds of brain damage have trouble switching between the letters and the numbers. Great test for that. Controlled oral word association. Love that test. It's also called the FAS test. Examiner, stopwatch, pen, as quickly as you can, name as many different words as you can that start with the letter F. The first one's always fast. Then the letter A, then the letter S. People with stronger frontal lobe ability are able to produce a larger number of those words. It's not exactly an IQ function, but it's another basic brain function. Wisconsin card sort is again about changing patterns, realizing that, oh, something that used to work isn't working anymore. I need to find a new strategy to finish this task. The Wechsler memory scale, memory testing, verbal learning, finger tapping for motor control. Count. How many times can they tap their finger in, I think it's 20 seconds. The Stroop, it's that famous color word test. You have to say what color the word is, but the word is written. The ink will be blue, but the word says green. You're supposed to ignore what the word says and just say what color ink it's printed in. It is one of the most maddening party games ever invented. But another very good frontal lobe test, and the Bender-Gestalt test, which is again about perceiving details versus whole features. Now, in this, roughly a dozen and a half studies, these tests and several others that I just didn't have a space for on the slide were given in batteries to these groups of pedophiles in order to see in what combination, which of these tests, each of which hit a different part of the brain, in which of these tests did the pedophiles not score as well as the non-pedophiles. Same as before. Every now and then, a test would find that the pedophiles would do more poorly, not on anything specific, but on everything. No evidence of localizability and nothing specifically general. Now, again, I'd like to point this out just to remind people how science works. Under trail making, we had 8 studies, 2 were significant. Okay, so is there a difference in their performance on trail making? 8 studies, 6 said no. So you kind of want to say no. Well, 2 said yes. So the article, who needs to cite it, says, oh, there's a difference, and just cite those 2 studies. But really what it is, you'll see the same name appearing over and over again. It's anybody who found any difference found every difference. Anybody who found no difference on any one thing found no difference on anything. There are 2 things that can do that. One is there really is no difference, and the other person is just running test after test after test until they get something significant. The other possibility is power, sample size, like telescope and microscope. If you only study 25 people, you're not going to find a difference no matter what test you're using. If you have 250 people, you're going to find differences in all of the tests if there is something like with the IQ, if they're generally deficient. It no longer matters which test you use, you'll find the difference if your telescope is powerful enough to see that very faint difference. That's what this seems to be saying. Not that there's a difference or not, there seems to be some low-grade, fuzzy, diffuse difference covering the whole thing rather than there being anything specific. That's really the message that those studies said. So not different from what we had with the IQ testing. Something's smelling off, but you can't quite yet localize it. Early brain imaging. Okay, this one is these are the CT studies. CT is computerized tomography. Who said that? Thank you. Computerized tomography. This one uses X-rays. It's kind of like these are X-rays, but high-tech X-rays, where we're familiar with a X-ray of the hand or X-ray of head, and you just get one two-dimensional photo of whatever you took the X-ray of. Now imagine the donut-shaped thing, lying in it. Well, imagine me lying down, this big donut thing inside around your head, Now, how it works is shoots out the X-ray, absorbs the X-ray to take the picture. Takes a picture, rotates 5 degrees, takes another picture, rotates 5 degrees, and goes all the way around. So now you can get the computer then computerized. The computer can then assemble each of those pictures into one 3-dimensional chunk. Neat. And that's the thing that we can now manipulate and perform statistics on. So it's based on X-rays, so it has both the pluses and minuses of that. You can only take so many of these in your life before you start having to worry about the amount of radiation that one is absorbing. The minus is that the X-rays do not give us nearly the precision that MRI does, and why we use that. So just to compare them, that's what we would see in a regular MRI, and this is what we would see in the kind of CT scans from those days. Right. So take 20 of these, find a way to average them together. How do you average together pictures? Again, we're back at computerized tomography and, the part of statistics where most people, start tuning out when you start saying things like variance. Try analyzing pictures in a quantitative way. Exactly. People just tune out in the statistics, which is why there's so much junky data in it, which is why there are so many junky reports. People don't, immediately see what requires an actual statistician to identify as a problem. It's much more hidden in these studies. Anyway, so if we had a group of people like this, and that big empty black thing in the middle, that's actually cerebrospinal fluid. The brain, through the middle of it, has these cisterns. They're called ventricles. That's where the CSF is, which the brain uses kind of like blood. Other nutrients, stuff circulates, and it supports the brain inside the skull. And, one set of ventricles down and comes all the way down the spinal cord. So if the brain is atrophied, or the brain isn't as large, or the brain is damaged or diseased or something, the brain tissue shrinks a little bit. Skull stays the same, brain tissue shrinks, so that ventricle area, the big black empty area in the middle, then grows larger. So very often what we would measure is the size of that ventricle, because skull size minus ventricle size equals remaining brain tissue size. And so then we could start measuring chunks of the brain, either the whole brain, or in this case we could divide it into the lobes, left, right, FPOT. Frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal, FPOT. That got me through most of my undergraduate biology. Right, so that's how we would analyze these kinds of data, but as you can see, when they're that fuzzy and you're actually trying to count, is this gray or black, gray or white? You can see where some of the literal fuzziness in doing these analyses has come from. But the basic idea, the basic conclusion from the set of CT studies is the same as the neuropsychological studies. Something's off, but it's something general, it's something diffuse, and it's not a particular thing that we could point at. Now, all of this research had trouble, whether both the CT studies and the neuropsychological studies. The biggest problem with all of them, over and over, small samples, small samples, small samples. They were either saying that they were declared that there were no differences, but mainly because the samples were too small to detect if there were differences there to be seen in the first place. Another one of the big problems was heterogeneous offender types. They would analyze sex offenders in general. Okay, but that doesn't tell me anything about sadists versus pedophiles versus pedophilic sadists versus exhibitionists versus child porn users, I have no reason to think that the exhibitionist brain would look like a sadistic pedophile brain. And I'm not even sure if a pedophile willing to touch and hurt a kid would look like one who's hands off but willing to go for child porn. They would also combine incest offenders with extrafamilial offenders. Again, the extrafamilial offenders are pretty likely to be pedophiles. Incest offenders, only a minority are. So again, by mixing these different kinds of offenders, when you come out with a result, you don't know who to attribute the result to. Which feature was it that this went along with it? Conversely, if you get no result, is it because there really is nothing there, or is it because I have a hodgepodge of several different kinds of people in the sample instead of a relatively uniform sample? Excessive data mining. This is the big statistical no-no that everybody knows they're not supposed to do and therefore hides evidence of their having done it. Give somebody 10 tests, one works out, and say, oh, report that one. That happens over and over and over. That happens over and over again because it's so easy to do. And is one of the things in medicine, medical medicine, in the kind of medicine where somebody can get sued, they're now actually doing this on purpose. One now needs to pre-register medical trials and report the result regardless of what the result was. Therefore, when you come out with a conclusion, we have a count of how many failures were, and we know this isn't the one that succeeded. We know this is the one out of whatever the appropriate number is that was successful. Lack of control samples, another very common one. They would give, the Lurie in Nebraska to a group of pedophiles and then just compare them onto what normal is supposed to be. If we were talking about IQ, they would give an IQ test to a bunch of pedophiles, say, the average was 90. 90 is 10 points below the population mean, therefore they're dumb. Well, there was no control sample. You still have no idea if they were 90 instead of 100 because these were the ones who were caught or couldn't get a good enough lawyer and so on. But they came to those conclusions despite not having any control group, never mind having a good control group or appropriate control group. And as I say, very selective citation of findings. And I really hold this one against the scientists who were writing it. This is just misrepresenting the state of knowledge. Like in the first example I gave you, there were 8 studies, and they would just cite the 2 that back their argument rather than here are all 8, here are the pluses and minuses to each, and here are the various possibilities, which is humbling, but what a good scientist does. Okay, so out of all of that babble, IQ, they seem to have a lower mean IQ, like blood pressure of the brain. It seems to suggest something in general is off, even though we don't know exactly what. The Lurie, Nebraska neuropsychological battery and the Halstead-Raytan battery, same basic pattern. Something, it's not just IQ, it seems to be a general pattern amongst various brain tasks, and it seems to be a general depression rather than anything specific. Same basic pattern with the neuropsych testing. For any major function of the brain, memory, recall, and so on, they seem to be they seem to perform not quite as well, but nothing so specific that we can say this part of the brain versus that part of the brain. CT scans, the biological equivalent of what the data were telling us so far. Something diffuse, something general, something that seems to be overall in the brain, but no one thing that we can yet point our fingers at. Okay. This brings me then up to one of our favorites. One of my favorites. Okay, now I have to tell another joke. The guy... Running joke. The guy who... Mike Kuban runs the phallometric test at CAMH, and then the Clark before that. So he's been running that test. It's got to be past 30 years now. I often have to point out with him that he is probably one of the only men on the planet who has seen more penis than I have. I keep the lights off. Okay, phallometry. Again, to start, Oh, sorry, confused myself. Okay, so now one of the advantages that I had in doing my research is that I had philometry available to me. Is that we had in our lab, definitely, the most accurate phallometric test available. It uses volumetric rather than circumferential measures and give us, the most precise determination of whether a person is genuinely pedophilic or not available. Okay, so that's the first step in understanding how things go now. As I say, the things that I had available to me were philometry, the neuropsychological tests that were available to me, and then the MRIs themselves. Okay. So for anyone who hasn't seen it before, phallometry is a psychophysiological technique for assessing the erotic interests in males. It's essentially, it's one of the most straightforward tests in the world. The man essentially, puts on what I can only describe as a blood pressure cuff on his penis. We show him pictures of adults, children, males, females, and then we use, landscape photography as a neutral category, and the computer measures to which he reacts the most to. It's the most, as I say, it's the most obvious test in the world. If it gives him an erection, he's into it. Surprise, surprise. This is the lab itself. This is one of my research assistants just showing how it looks. You can see he has 3 different screens that normally would have the human stimuli on it for today's. Because I had to bring these slides over the border, I just have the neutral categories are what he's looking at. The picture in the middle is a horseshoe. A couple years ago, we decided to turn that picture upside down. We thought it should be, the horseshoe up is the good luck. So we turned that slide upside down, even though the picture was right side up. Now, of course, as he's taking the test are the earphones. So at the same time as viewing the pictures of adults, children, male, female, he's also listening to little erotic stories describing an interaction with the male, female, adult, child in the picture, in the scenario. This glass cylindrical cuff is the thing that goes, glass cylinder is what goes over the entire penis. The tube up top is where the air that gets pushed out as it gets more of an erection then gets measured by the computer. And then this cuff thing over here, it's just a simple metal ring with an inside-out condom wrapped around it and the tip cut off. So when he puts his penis through it, I get to do this legitimately in front of an audience. So when he puts his penis through it, we inflate the latex cuff, which is then, seals the penis into the cylinder. So then as air gets pushed out of the cylinder, that's what the computer can measure. Oh, did I? Showed you that? Showed you that? Showed you that? Okay.
Sounds hot.
For the examinee, yeah, it's too dirty. So again, I had to white it out for today's purposes, but that's really what the photographs look like. This is not what anyone would really call child pornography. These are not erotic pictures. They're the kind of, basic anatomical nudes that you would see in, any medical textbook or endocrinological textbook. But we picked the slides, because they are very easily attributable to the age group to which they represent, and the narratives that they. Let's see if it works. I have a tape in a narrative. I forgot it was here. Let's see if this plays. Yeah, like something technological was going to work for me. What was I thinking? Okay, but the narratives go like this. You're watching a late movie on TV with your neighbor's 12-year-old daughter. You have your arm around her shoulders and your fingers brush against her chest. You realize that her breasts have begun to develop. And then there are more very specific descriptions from the narrator of the physical attributes of the object. in order to emphasize that the object belongs to the particular character, has the particular features that the person is into. If they're describing an adult, the narrative describes fully formed breasts. If the narrative is depicting a kid, it will mention flat chest or breast buds if it's one of the hemophilic stimuli, and so on. And so the way that we then reduce all of these pieces of information to a single number is relatively straightforward. We take the person's response to whatever maximum category that they had, and we subtract from that whatever their attraction to adults was. If they are substantially more attracted to one of the categories of children than to the categories of adults, Bob's your uncle. This is the average results we get of everybody who had come through our lab, but had 3 or more adult female victims of a sexual assault. Okay, so these are rapists. These are people who have 3 independent victims. So these are very, very definitely not pedophiles. If they were pedophiles, they'd be going after the kids, not the adults. And the shape of the curve is perfectly logical. Their highest responses to adult females. No surprise. Next highest responses to pubescent age females. Definitely not adults, but there will be some, pictures that they were seeing would be describing a downy, wispy pubic hair instead of adult, coarse pubic hair, and so on. So these people respond a little bit to that, but not nearly as much as they do to adults, and they really do not respond to female children at all, male children at all, and if anything, when you start showing them pictures of males, their penises retract. These are men with 3 or more female child victims. Now, their most common response was to respond the most to the pubescent age kids. That's because we have more hemophilic offenders in our samples than we do pedophilic offenders. Most of these offenses were against 11 to 14-year-olds. So when I group them all together, they're a bit elevated. But you can see very definitely that they show their greatest response to their favorite category, the ones that they are offending against. But interestingly, their responses to adults, on average, was almost the same as their responses to pre-pubescent children. So if we run the thought experiment, what if I had this phallometric test, or what if the phallometric test I was using was designed using only adult stimuli and prepubescent stimuli without the pubescent stimuli? What would this graph look like? It would look like they're responding to adults as much as they are to children, and I would have a completely invalid test, even though everything about the test is valid, but it didn't include the category to which the person is most most interested. Unfortunately, that's what most phallometric labs do. They only use adults and children and leave out the pubescent children. Men with 3 or more male child victims. Not quite the analogous of that. The men who go after male children seem to prefer prepubescent male children, where the men who went after female children seem to go after pubescent children, on average. And the ones who are after prepubescent children are also very uninterested in adults. It's like both they and they are kind of phobic of the body hair and symbols of adult masculinity, of adult maleness. And so somehow it's the lack of hair, lack of muscle, and so on that these people seem to be responding to. So both the pedophiles of each type seem to dislike adult males, except for regular everyday gay men. Surprise, surprise, into men. And least favorite was not women. It was girls, with the women a little bit in between. All of that is to say the test is very, very effective. and was invented by, I never got to meet him. It's one of my greatest regrets. He died, I think, 2 years, maybe if that, before I got to CAMH. But the entire procedure was invented by Kurt Freund. Now, the way he did it, as I say, in the lab, we measure this in volume. We measure the amount of air that gets pushed out of that cylinder, where most labs use that the ring, the mercury and strain gauge ring. So it's the amount that gets stretched by in that elastic, and that's what the computer is measuring. It's not nearly as accurate. First, the positioning on the penis makes a difference because different parts of the penis change size at different rates. Some parts of it change very little, especially at the base. That can interfere with it, and it's not, as I say, it's not nearly as accurate. Although today we have the circuitry to be able to measure the changes in airflow and air pressure directly, when he invented it, he didn't. He actually used a long tube of water with a meter stick taped up against it, so as there was more and less of interaction, it would push the water through the tube, and the result was the philometrist would then write down how far the water went in the tube during each stimulus presentation. Water beads, so then he found out he had to mix it with a little bit of alcohol, so he got a nice even reading through the thing. I've been looking for the leftover alcohol, have not been able to find it, except in that picture. Now, as I say, volumetric philometry is quite accurate, and I will tell you exactly how accurate. The important part being that it is much more accurate than is circumferential philometry. This part is the actual, it's called the receiver operating characteristic curve, which this is actually how we measure the false positives versus false negatives that one gets on a test. Now, unfortunately, people try to think of the accuracy of a test in one number. It's accurate whatever % of the time. That's not how one can't really think of a test in one number, because a test can make two kinds of mistakes. A test can say you can have the thing when you really don't, or that you don't have the thing when you really do. You can have this kind of mistake whatever % of the time, and you can have this kind of a mistake whatever % of the time, and they are not necessarily the same number. So you can have a test that's very, very sensitive, but it also accidentally diagnoses people that it shouldn't. And that's one kind of inaccuracy, and you can get the opposite. A test that, if it says you're a pedo, you're definitely a pedo, but you miss a lot of the others also. So you can have accidents in either kind of way. So you need two numbers in order to accurately describe the accuracy of a test. What it works out for philometry is what we call a sensitivity of 61% and a specificity of 96%. Sensitivity is, of these, if you imagine, a 2x2, you got it versus you don't, and the test says you got it versus don't. So you can got it, and the test says you got it, or you could not have it, and the test says you don't have it, or you can have the two mistakes. You got it, but the test says no. You don't got it, but the test says yes. So these two are accurate. These two are inaccurate. Sensitivity is when you have the thing, what's the probability of the test detecting it? So for philometry, for this specific philometric test, of the people whom we know are pedophiles, 61% of them will come out as pedophilic on the test. So of 100 pedophiles, the test will correctly detect 61 of them. Flip side, if I have a group of 100 people who are definitely not pedophiles, they're rapists of adult women or whatever, the test will correctly say that 96 of them are not pedophiles. I will have 4 false positives. So of these two kinds of mistakes, I will miss roughly 40% of the pedophiles. Just because the test says that they're not a pedophile doesn't mean that they're not a pedophile. We miss a substantial proportion of them on purpose. The test is biased. On purpose. We shifted the test on purpose to be biased against diagnosing somebody as pedophilic. That's why these two numbers don't match. There's not an equal 25% probability of making any kind of a mistake. Missing is a potential mistake. An accidental diagnosis, not very likely. That's done on purpose because of the potential effect it can have on the person taking the test. If the test says they're not pedophilic, I can still diagnose them. But if the test says that they are pedophilic, there's no fucking way I'm going to be able to keep that quiet in their file. Their life is over as they know it. Therefore, we have designed, my predecessors designed the test specifically. Do not diagnose unless you are fucking certain, because you are going to be ending this person's life. So we purposefully are willing to sacrifice missing 40% of these pedophiles in order to make it very unlikely for percentage time that we accidentally diagnose or give a result of pedophilic in somebody who should not. That's on purpose. Okay, so that's the accuracy of this test. Unfortunately, again, this is for the volumetric test, not the circumferential. Labs that use circumferential tests are much less accurate. Most of them do not have hemophilic stimuli, and most of them have not attempted to publish how accurate their test is. Again, these are tests that end people's lives, and we treat them like they're polygraphs when we should be treating them like they're polygraphs. I'm glad you got that reference. Right, those of us who know polygraphs say, yeah. We should be treating a lot of these phallometric tests. We should be treating phallometric tests from unvalidated tests the same way that we treat polygraphs, which is with no small amount of cynicism. Unfortunately, there are people who just, like Paul Fedorov, assume that this test is like a blood test and it's 100% accurate, and they just keep coming up with one wrong conclusion after another. Okay, now that necessarily brings us to how do we know that phyllometry is valid at all? We get, people who are responding versus not responding to it. That is fine, but it works backwards. It's people who did commit an offense are now taking the test, getting whatever result, but really what we want to know for the validity of phyllometry is, of the people who take the test, what then happens in their future. We want to know what its predictive ability is. Now, again, this is a very, very famous meta-analysis. There have been a couple of studies, relevant studies since then, but the basic finding, if anything, has only gotten stronger since I hesitate to think this was 20 years ago now. Everybody remember when this came out? I mean, this was a huge, huge deal, and it was 20 years ago. Okay. So again, it was a meta-analysis of studies that used many, many different kinds of variables and prediction instruments to try to see, who then committed a later offense, including phyllometry. And these are all the different things that they tested. MMPI scale, 5 was one of the most. Anyway, of all of the different symptoms that were tested, that there were enough data in the meta-analysis for, the number one most accurate predictor of who went on to commit a new offense was a phallometric test demonstrating that the person has an atypical sexual interest. Again, Bob's your uncle. So that's true even with the garbagey tests. With better tests, we can get, in theory, we should expect that much more accurate a set of results. Okay, so out of this, we got what pedophilia is, we got what phyllometry is, and we know the sensitivity and specificity of the particular phallometric test that we used in my lab. Now, one of the things that this was such a great advantage in my lab because I was able to identify these were the pedophiles as opposed to non-pedophilic child molesters. So I was able to remove the non-pedophilic child molesters from my sample, leaving only a sample of, do I say pure pedophiles, good pedophiles, accurately diagnosed pedophiles. Now, my question here was still, is it in the brain? But my other question was, when did it start being in the brain? I mean, was it in the brain since the offense? Was this, something that changed in the brain during stress of incarceration? Was this something that was different in the brain before the offense happened? And if so, when in life did it start to become detectable? Is this something that changed in the brain during puberty and puberty development, childhood and whatever was going on in childhood? Or, my personal favorite, but I always hesitate, we like the conclusion because it's always such a sexy one, is it prenatal? Those, of course, were my questions. Now, the hard part with any of those kinds of studies are I only have the person after childhood, after puberty, after the offense, after the incarceration, and now here for testing and maybe SVP legislation down here, or we have I was going to say different, I'll call it humane system in Canada. It has its minuses, but it's better than what you down here loosely call justice. Oh, I think we should change the name of the down here. Instead of Department of Justice, it should be Department of Vengeance. I mean, let's just frickin' call it what it is. This is about revenge. This is not justice. Maybe we should make, the superheroes instead of the Justice League. We could, change faces on them so they're politicians and make them the Vengeance League. American flags would fit all over that shit. Oh, the Canadians, I guess, would be the bad guys? Okay. Sorry, I did it again. Where was I? The bad guy, logic. Yeah, I had an anecdote before that. Oh, well. If it was funny, it will come back. Okay, so we were starting on these basic studies, and I needed to look, that was it. I needed to look back in time. I only have these people, after all of this happened. How do you run these studies to figure out what was going on early? Self-report? Kurt Freund had a saying. How do you know when a pedophile is lying? When his lips are moving. I mean, these people have every reason on the planet to just tell me what it is they think I want to hear. They have no reason to tell the truth, and they often have a lot of reasons for, fooling themselves into what they want the truth to be. So self-report, I'm a brain guy. So I needed to think of ways not only to find out if they were different, but if they were different in some objective, non-self-report way that they won't be able to or won't think of manipulating that tells me what was happening early in their lives. This is why scientists get little sleep. Now, my own first set of tests was, again, IQ, just like the early studies that everybody else was doing, because it was widely available. Every patient who came through our clinic got a basic IQ test because that helped us, figure out which treatment groups they would be best fit for. But now I got to divide them according to their phallometric results. I got to divide them into pedophiles, hebophiles, and, remember the word, teleophiles. Like a charm. Perfect ordering. The pedophiles had lower mean IQs than the teleophiles. The teleophiles were indistinguishable from, the population norm of 100, and the hebophiles are exactly where they should be, right in between. So the pattern both tells me, yes, there's something about IQ, brain health going on, and it tells me that hebophilia is real. It's meaningful, and it's fitting in this, valid area where you would expect it to, which would follow from the definition of it, which was, again, important to the debate over people arguing whether hebophilia really exists at all and whether it counts as pedophilia. Then verbal memory. Again, the idea with using non-IQ tests is to see how general this was across the various parts of the brain. Could I identify something specific? Same basic pattern. The teleophiles, normal, normal, normal. Pedophiles, significantly below normal. And the hebophiles, somewhere in between. This was verbal memory. Got exactly the same thing with visuospatial memory. So it wasn't anything specific to my test, wasn't anything specific to me, wasn't even specific to my research assistants. The people who were offenders against adults, typical. Offenders against the youngest children, the most atypical. And the offenders against pubescent age children, somewhere in between. Now again, my this validated that I was getting the same basic pattern of results that everybody else was getting. Good, I can keep my job. The hard part is now, how do I test somebody in the here and now to find out what was going on in their brain that they are unable to tell me, and it happened 20 years ago. But we did think of some. Accidents causing unconsciousness, head injuries. So again, there's no particular reason for any of these people really to lie to me about head injuries or about the age at which they suffered that head injury. They would just tell me what happened, and it had to be severe enough to cause unconsciousness. So a concussion had to be involved, and the pattern came out again. The pedophiles came out with a much greater probability of having suffered a concussion than the teleophiles did, and the hebophiles basically somewhere in between. So now I'm looking back in time. These are things that happened a long time ago, and the only effect was for head injuries that happened before age 13. Head injuries that happened after age 13 made no difference. This was my first back-in-time variable. The head injury was important if it happened when the brain was still developing, but it doesn't matter if the injury happened after development was completed. That's neat. Proportions falling grade, or grade failure doesn't happen anymore now. People are shunted into special education programs, so we just put the two variables together. But it was the same basic idea. Even though I have a person with whatever their IQ is now, I wanted evidence of there having been something going on a long time ago. So, no particular reason for these people to lie to me, no particular reason for them to lie to me about the age at which it happened. But we basically found, again, as I say, grade failing stopped happening. Now people are shunted into special education programs. So when I add them together, the total has stayed the same over the generations. What happens has changed. The pink is becoming less and less common, and the white is becoming more and more common. But the total of something educationally is up with this guy, that's relatively even. But when I divide them according to their phallometric results, the teleophilic non-offenders, 30%, which to me is still pretty substantial, 30% of a sample suffering head injuries. Now, again, these are not regular everyday guys from the street. These are people who usually had some reason to want to come in for the couple of dollars and take our test. So these are people, with their own issues, and so I think that klutziness is what's related to their head injuries. The sex offenders, a bit elevated, but the offenders against children elevated the most. 50 and 60%, huge. And again, this happened decades before the offenses did. Physical height we looked at. A little bit self-consciously, but we looked at physical height. Again, this is one of those, all right, if this is something about development of the brain, development of the early brain, height is one of those things that tells me about general health and general growth. So is everything basically healthy? Is whatever developmentally that went wrong, is it restricted to the brain, or was it the entire thing? Turns out it was the entire thing. The teleophilic non-offenders, the tallest. Teleophilic sex offenders, the rapists, a bit shorter. And then the hebophiles, and then the pedophiles. Again, in the same basic, very consistent, logical order. Just for a sense of perspective, the 2.5 centimeters-ish on average, 2.5 centimeters to shortness is about what would happen if a mother smoked when she was pregnant with the kid. So it's what we would consider pretty substantial. Then this is the one that got me in the womb. With all of the others, again, it's not really clear where in development these things happen. It's the earlier I find a variable to show me something that happened back in time, I'm still finding things earlier and earlier. Handedness was the first big one that got me prenatal. Handedness is caused by one and only one thing: brain organization. It's which hemisphere is dominant over which hemisphere. In utero, the left hemisphere grows first. It grows it's a couple of weeks ahead in growth of the right hemisphere. It grows faster. It takes all the dominant functions, and because things cross at the spinal cord, left hemisphere dominance causes right hand dominance. If, however, something happens during development, poor nutrition, maternal stress, whatever it is, that interferes with the normal growth of the left hemisphere, so it slows, but the right hemisphere then, brain is smart, Mother Nature is smart, mothers are smart. The right hemisphere starts to grow to try to catch up. In part of that catching up, it starts taking over functions that used to be or would otherwise have been controlled by the dominant hemisphere. So when it becomes dominant, it now starts or is more likely to take over handedness, and we get people who are either ambidextrous or, myself included, completely left-handed. If there's a frickin' way to be different, I'll find it. And and there also, because a lot of people ask this, that's why scientifically ambidextrousness is lumped in with left-handedness, because it means something was going on that reorganized the brain. There's actually two kinds of left-handedness. One is the hemisphere making up and it redirects the handedness. The other one is the one that runs in families, the one that seems to be kind of genetic. And my father's left-handed, so I suspect that's the one I have. And so there is a non-pathological kind of left-handedness, but what I suspect that's what's important here is, of course, the actual handedness. Now, the handedness, again, this difference in the brain parts, handedness starts to develop late first trimester, early second trimester. So again, not only am I in the womb, I'm way in the womb. And again, like night and day. Handedness, left-handedness, non-right-handedness technically, is roughly 10% of the population on average, 8 to 10, but it was 35-ish% among the pedophiles. Again, enormous difference. The only other populations that have non-right-handedness rates that high are the other populations for which we have very obvious, now well-recognized prenatal brain involvement. Autism and schizophrenia. Try to come up with an explanation for this and height and IQ and memory and so on without it being pedophilia is in the brain. And it's whatever happened in the development of this person, it's not just the pedophilia. There's nothing about being 2.5 centimeters short that makes you a pedophile or left-handed that makes you a pedophile. Again, for the record, I'm into adult men. Not gerontophilic, but, well, they can be gerontophilic. Okay, so of all of these things, again, it's impossible to explain this except by saying something went wrong during development. But now we can embellish the story a sentence or two. It went prenatal development. Whatever chain of events it is that ultimately leads to pedophilia, the first links of that chain have to be before birth. There's just no other way to explain this. That isn't to say that some miracle happens in early second trimester and the person is now destined to be a pedophile. All of these things can merely be sensitivities, reflections of sensitivities that make them more or less likely to pick up something else that's going on in the environment. It's easy to imagine a combination of, again, the usual examples I use are maternal stress and maternal nutrition, because again, they do give rise to very, very broad, very diffuse possible, outcomes. So if we just look at any pair of those outcomes, we'll find a correlation. Neither one caused the other. They're both simply results of the same initial link in that chain. But if we can find whatever that fucking link is, we might be able to prevent the entire of all of this breadth of whatever's going on. So it seems like thing happens, reduces IQ, changes handedness, and makes, interferes with the person's psychosexual development. All the same, if we could just figure out what that... Sure I do. It's at the end. It's the black one. It's That's one of the funny things about speaking rather than writing. I also do a lot of writing, which, I don't put any of my jokes in writing. They don't quite, because you can't spell, but with a microphone, it made perfect sense. Everybody knew exactly what I meant. Tell me what word it. Ray Blanchard could come up with a word for this. Gagaphilia. Okay, so overall, again, deep breath, lower IQs, lower scores on memory tests, less right-handedness, more frequent grade failure, less physical height. So again, we seem to have something went wrong during development, which seems to have given rise to a bunch of atypicalities, most of which we're not going to notice. There's no reason to notice a 10-point IQ difference. There's no reason to notice right-handedness and these, and an inch and a half too short. Pedophilia is the one we notice, and that's what then starts us looking for all of the others. So that then, when I still had all black hair, brought us to, all right, if I have all of this indirect evidence of it being in the brain, can I, most important thing, get a grant? Now, even though everybody would have said, oh, it's a perfectly good idea, we need to know if pedophilia is in the brain, we don't give grants to good ideas. We give grants to ideas that cover the ass of the people who are reviewing the grants. Oh, this looks legitimate. He's published lots of this before. Let's give him the money. Don't care if the idea is stupid or a rehash of what they've done before. This is a legitimate-looking person, so I look like a good reviewer if I keep picking up the good people instead of the good ideas. 1, drives me nuts. 2, although I will very quickly damn the funding agencies for their various mistakes, I think they would be making fewer mistakes if they had reasonable funding levels. If they gave out a reasonable amount of research money, they wouldn't be, faced with these Sophie's choices. Sophie's choices? Is that the correct plural? Sophie's choices? Choices of Sophie. Have I now gone older than the 50-somethings? The time between the Holocaust and Sophie's Choice equals the time between Sophie's Choice and today. That'll keep you up tonight. Okay, so the basic question, can we use brain scans really to see, the physical effects, the genuine, circuitry underlying the behaviors that we seem to be seeing? What time is our next break?
Lunch.
Perfect. Okay, so MRIs, my goal here is to demystify it. If you, miss this entire piece and just want to jump to the results, fine. But this is the part where nobody actually ever talks about it because everybody says, yeah, MRI, and, moves on to, glitzy, colorful photos. I find this actually very useful because armed with this, you can now, read and look up and listen to information about any MRI study and have a basic idea of what's going on, enough that the wool can't get pulled over your eyes quite so easily. Now, I like to list each of these because these are the various brain scans that everybody talks about. And usually one will just say brain scan as if we know what that means. We have CT scans, PET scans, MRI, and now we have fMRI. People vaguely know those are brain scans. Couldn't tell you if these are even synonyms for each other, especially MRI and fMRI. Only people basically know that fMRI came after MRI. So they will just say it thinking it's the most advanced kind of MRI, when actually it's a different technology. Okay, these two, oh, right, and there's also, sometimes you'll hear about open MRI. Open MRI is exactly the same as an MRI. It's not a different technology at all. The only thing that's different about open MRI is you can see here that tiny little space that it feels like you're going into a torpedo tube. Anyone get an MRI? Feels like you're going into a torpedo tube. And it says, now just close your eyes and relax. Oh, right, tick, 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 clunk, clunk, clunk. It's like you're in one of the Disney haunted house, only when, and don't move. Oh, and by the way, you might have a tumor. Now don't move. Right, that MRI. Anyway, so the only thing different is that there are some people who cannot tolerate that torpedo tube. Either they're claustrophobic, and even a non-claustrophobic person can have trouble in that because it is so tight. You're on a bed and you can't get yourself out. You know, remember the machine slides you in and out, so you couldn't escape. It is claustrophobic. And then there were some people who were just physically too obese to be able to fit in the tube. There's a, don't ask me what the weight maximum is, but there's a weight maximum, and some people just do not fit in the tube. So there's open MRI. Take the whole machine and turn it sideways. So now the circle that normally the head would go in is now for this person over her belly. So now there's more space around. There's more space around her, so it's less claustrophobic, and a person of girth can fit in it. You don't have the physical walls. The downside to it is that because the magnet is not as close to your head, or whatever's getting scanned, it's not as clear of a scan. So that's why the regular MRI is preferable. But if it cannot be done, the open MRI is a possibility. So that's all that open MRI is. Okay, so of these, the CT scans, as I said, use X-rays. They give us an idea of the structure of the brain. It's a still picture. As I say, relatively low clarity, like the picture that I showed you before. And one of the biggest minuses with it is that because it uses X-rays, the radiation does build up over life in tissues, so we can only use it so many times. PET scan. The PET scan came out roughly when the CT scans did. PET scans are the ones that use radioactivity. So where the CT scan used X-rays, standard X-rays. The PET scan, that's the one where you need an IV, and you need an IV with a radioactive glucose. It's a glucose with, so that as the molecules decay, the way it works is it's glucose, it's sugar, so it gets absorbed by whichever parts of the brain are most active. The active parts of the brain are the parts that absorb the most glucose. If it absorbs the most glucose, it's absorbing the most radio-labeled glucose. By measuring then how much of that radioactivity builds up in different parts of the brain, then tells us which parts of the brain have been active over the course of that PET scan. So where the CT scan gives us a still picture of a brain, even a dead brain, a PET scan gives us brain activity. It doesn't tell us anything about the structure of the brain. It tells us which parts of the brain are active over the course of the PET scan. And again, we have to limit the exposure. It's radioactivity. The MRI, now we're using magnetism. So the CTs were X-rays, the PET scans were radioactivity, and MRI and fMRI is magnetism. There is no limit to how much magnetism we can be exposed to, so there's no limit to the number of MRIs we can take. There is a limit to how powerful the magnetic field can be that we can stay in before it starts to interfere with us physiologically. And that's roughly the level of MRI power magnets that we have now. The power of a magnet is measured in a unit called Tesla. Oh, unit called Tesla. All of a sudden, the word Tesla is now famous. Tesla he made me look sober. Tesla was a famous scientist, early 20th century physics. Batshit crazy. Anyway, brilliant, batshit crazy. So now the unit for magnetism is called the Tesla. Early MRIs were about 1 Tesla, now they're at about 3. The only time you hear about a stronger one is when we're doing animal research. Like on rats, we can put up to 7 Tesla. The downside to the MRI, remember the metal stuff? Especially anything with wire, because the magnet is exquisitely powerful. This is one of those, and I often show people, take whatever little thing, paperclip, you can't believe how powerful the thing is. One of my favorites, I show patients this, take a an American quarter. It has to have a copper core. A Canadian quarter it won't work with. You take it, hold the corner on the edge, ding it over, and you watch it fall. And the thing falls in slow motion. I love physics. The thing falls in slow motion. Magnetism resists changes in magnetism by putting out an opposite magnetic field. Specifically, metal, copper especially, moving in a magnetic field creates electricity. Electricity moving in a wire causes a magnetic field. That's why we call it electromagnetism. You either send power through a copper wire and it has a little magnetic field, or you just take a still wire and just move it around in the magnetic field and electricity starts moving through. That's how generators work. You either take a magnet and move it around the copper wire and that starts the power, or you send power through the wire and it creates the magnetic field. You can freely convert one to the other. Like I say, physics. Copper core quarter. Copper core quarter. It's in a magnetic field. If I tip it over, it starts to move. Metal starts to move in a magnetic field. It creates, so electricity starts moving in the core. The moving electricity in the core creates a magnetic field, which resists the magnetic field that it's in, which creates electricity, which creates magnetism, which creates electricity. So that's why it takes so long to... I don't know why everybody isn't a physicist. Yes, I do, the math. The math is why people are not physicists. Quarter, magnetic. So now this happens in us also. Nerves are, electrons moving back and forth. If the magnetic field is too powerful, the water, the ions in the water in us, the magnetic field can start changing, how freely that stuff can move. Anyway, so that's why there's a maximum magnetism we can take. No. Oh, God, there was one time, again, that no metal in the thing. Janitor, mop, swing. Yeah, that was 2 weeks of repair. Again, sometimes I just, when they say no metal, they mean no metal. Oh, and of course the worst one is if somebody's in the machine when somebody with metal comes walking in, it's a bullet. Okay. fMRI. Now, MRI, standard MRI, like CT scans, gives us structure. It gives us a gorgeous, still picture of the brain. A gorgeous still picture of the brain. The fMRI gives us now function of the brain. I'm jumping ahead. Okay, so this is the MRI scan itself. This is us going subatomic. Now over on the far end, as I say, normally atoms just kind of dance around in whatever free field, and they have a north and south pole and positive and negative charges, like everything else in a free field. They're random. In a magnetic field, they tend to line up. They tend to line up with the magnetic field, so the north and south poles of the atom line up with the north and south pole of the magnetic field that it's in. Now, once something is in that magnetic field and they are, relatively, and they are held relatively still in that field, we then ping it with a radio wave, a radio pulse, same as a regular everyday radio. And if you remember, radio is actually the same as light, as actual visible light, but a much longer wavelength. Otherwise, it works exactly the same way as light. Now, what happens is, when we start getting these these atoms with north and south lined up with a magnetic field, they now respond to that radio pulse. It's kind of like I'm pushing them slightly out of their alignment. It's the radio wave that they're trying to absorb, and the energy pushes them. And then when the pulse turns off, they spring back, and they give back that energy, the photon that they absorbed. So when I send a radio pulse, a photon towards them, they absorb it, and when I turn the pulse off, it bounces back. It's that bouncing back that we measure in the machine. So the amount of bounce back, or the density of the tissues that bounce back, gives me an idea or tells me the density of the tissue at that point. The different tissues of the brain have different densities. The cerebrospinal fluid in the middle, the white matter, the cabling tissue that brings it all together, and then the gray matter layer all the way on the edge. Since they have different densities, we can get these gorgeous, highly precise pictures of the brain, 3D, using our globe, because, of course, when one of these photons comes out, they come out in pairs, photon and antiphoton. Isn't that just the Star Trek-iest, hottest thing? So because there are two, we can now, another great word, triangulate. The computer can then triangulate to figure out where they came from. And that's how we get these gorgeous, gorgeous pictures. I know. I don't know why everybody isn't a physicist. I don't know why everybody isn't a mathematician. Oh, who's it? Who somebody referred to Big Bang Theory. Or not. Okay. Now, MRIs are tuned to water. Those are the things that are jiggling around. If you remember, there's one oxygen and two hydrogens. So the two hydrogens, give it the positive and negative, because they're kind of it's not a straight line. It's not H-O-H. It's H, and then it's O, and then the two H's kind of triangle off like that, because there are two extra electrons just kind of sitting there that push the two hydrogen protons to the other side. Okay, I'm going too far. So MRI is tuned to water. You can set the magnetic field, or you can set the radio pulse in order to pulse any kind of molecule according to the frequency that that molecule usually vibrates at. The MRIs are set to do water because that's what we're mostly made of. The images show structure. MRI shows brain structure, not brain function. It's a still picture, even though it takes 10 to 15 minutes on average to get the whole thing. There are many variations. There are many variations now of MRI, either by pinging the person with different kinds of radio pulses, or with different frequencies of radio pulses, because different tissues and different substances are sensitive to different frequencies. So by changing the frequency, we get feedback back from of different substances in the brain. None of them are really in use for clinical purposes. At the moment, it's still all research purposes. And the old techniques like CT scans still have their uses. PET scans still have their uses. So it's not like the old technologies are entirely obsolete. It just depends on the particular thing that you're looking at in order to know which technology to use. Most of the time, we're just looking at structure of the basic brain, so most of the time, it's basic MRI that's useful. Okay, so as I say, MRI is fMRI, where CT scan was structure and PET scan was function. MRI is structure. fMRI is function. That's what the F is for. It's functional MRI, where a regular MRI is a high-resolution, still photograph, 10, 15 minutes to take the entire brain. fMRI instead passes through the entire brain in 2 seconds. So it sacrifices resolution. Imagine if you're just on your iPhone and you take a still picture and you get your whatever mega fucking pixel, picture of it. But if you take a photo, again, if you take a movie, it's lots of photos, but you have to sacrifice that resolution in order to be able to take the next picture that much more quickly. Exactly the same with MRI and fMRI. And fMRI is an MRI, but instead of spending 10 minutes to take the picture, it spends 2 seconds so that it's ready for the net to start again at the top in the next 2 seconds, and then you come out with this, however long you need it to be, movie of the brain's activity over the course of that time. Less resolution, but it shows me what changes over time. Now with the PET scan, remember it was radioactive glucose, which I say like I'm mainlining. It was radioactive glucose because the active parts of the brain absorb the glucose, and then we measure the radioactive decay of where that glucose was. It's the same basic idea, except what the fMRI is measuring is water, blood flow. The active parts of the brain use more energy. To get the glucose, the blood vessels around that brain area expand for increased blood flow exactly the way that they do in a muscle. So what we're measuring really is the increased water, blood is mostly water, in those areas of the brain. And that's what an fMRI is measuring. So once demystified, that makes perfect sense. There is nothing magical about an fMRI. There's no, great big spanking new thing that makes it better than an MRI. Still picture versus movie. It's actually quite simple. I don't know if people never say how simple it is because they want everybody to think how smart they are for knowing what it is, or if it's because in the media and the reporters don't think to ask because they don't want to look stupid for not knowing what it is. So we just have everybody kind of pretending when really the shit's not bad. Okay, so actually using the MRIs itself on the pedos themselves. Now, as I said before, there were the frontal lobe theorists and there were the temporal lobe theorists. The frontal lobe theorists, which I affectionately refer to as idiots. What, I haven't been affectionate? Are there any frontal lobe theorists in the room? Versus the temporal lobe. Again, so we wanted to, people who were looking for evidence were looking for evidence either in the front or essentially behind the ear because they were looking for inhibition, disinhibition, or for the 4 Fs. Now, at my first study, when I first started doing this, we were 3 different groups at the time. There was me in Canada and 2 groups in Germany. The 2 groups in Germany didn't know of each other's existence. They hadn't yet unified. They hadn't yet started remember the prevention program, Prevention Project Dunkelfeld? Hadn't started yet. They were that was in the formative stages. They were still applying for money. I got to be on that grant committee for and that was another one where yes. Did I mention yes? The only problem with that meeting was that it was in Berlin. Love getting invited to talks in Europe. I always add the extra couple days to see whatever city. So we're there. So my partner and I went because we, tied it into a vacation. We, upgraded our tickets back so there were business tickets. The connecting flight, of course, was late. So we flew from one city to the other city, and we're going to miss the fucking connection. So there we are, and this was one of the flights that didn't hit it didn't go directly to the terminal. You had to walk down the stairs and into the So there we are, with our bags where I am just out of my mind because we're going to miss our connecting flight. And we were first out because we were business class. We're going down the stairs, again, in Berlin where the connecting flight was. And at the bottom of the stairs were these 2 police cars, lights going, and in that thick German accent, Dr. Cantor, give me your papers. We are taking you directly to security. And this little Jewish alarm. Warning, warning, alert, alert. The computer had read that I was going to miss the flight, so they wanted my papers to take me and bring me through security to make my flight. Right.
That was nice, German.
But somehow that accent, asking for your papers, we are taking you directly to security. Right, all of a sudden my partner, who's a step and a half behind me, I don't know him. Germany, Grant, Prevention Project, Dunkelfeld, slide. Okay, so there were the 2 German groups and I doing basically the same thing. Each of us were in facilities where, pedophiles were coming through, and we did, we each had our various grants. We asked for volunteers to come take a brain scan. Now, by sheer coincidence, this set of 3 papers worked out to have answered the question unintentionally answered exactly the question that we ended up having in front of us. The Schultz group and the Schiffer group again, some people were looking for frontal lobe stuff, some people were looking for temporal lobe stuff. By pure coincidence, Schiffer is a frontal lobe theorist and Schultz was a temporal lobe theorist. Schiffer thought it was going to be in the frontal lobe, Schultz thought it was going to be in the temporal lobe. They both had very limited numbers of subjects in their studies. So they didn't have the statistical power, and they knew they didn't have the statistical power, to their credit, to look at the entire brain. They had to pre-select the areas that they wanted to. Remember the t-test and capitalizing on t-tests. You know, you run enough t-tests, sooner or later you'll find one that's significant. Same basic problem. If they wanted to look at, pick your number, 20 areas of the brain, okay, if you're looking for PO5, you know, 20 areas of the brain, one of them is going to come out. In order to try to minimize the probability of that happening, fine, that's why they wanted to look at as small a number as they could get away with instead of looking at the entire brain. If they looked at the entire brain, everybody, except the Journal of Sexual Medicine, would have immediately said this is not a valid design, you're just capitalizing on chance. So Schiffer looked just at a couple of frontal lobe areas, and Schultz looked just at a couple of temporal lobe areas. And these are the areas that Schultz said were significantly different in their pedos versus their non-pedos. That itty-bitty little gunk right there at the, in color. Oh, you can always tell in MRI studies, color means significantly different from the other group. And black and white is the underlying brain, and we're just, you know, showing the two figures on top of each other to give an idea of where the differences are. So Schultz believed he confirmed his own hypothesis. He said that he did find differences in the temporal lobe. And he did find differences in the temporal lobe. Schiffer, who was looking for differences in the frontal lobe, found differences in the frontal lobe. Now, Schultz looked at three areas altogether in, as you can see, a relatively small sample. Schiffer looked at 17 different areas, 5% each, you know, 0.05 each. You know, there, as I say, there is nothing, although it's very easy to get intimidated by MRI research and MRI lingo, it's the same t-test problem and overcorrection or undercorrection problem as before. You try ROI is region of interest, sorry. So if he was hypothesizing 17 different areas of the brain to be different, first, if somebody tells me that they think there were 17 areas of the brain that are being different, they're not thinking any areas of the brain are being different. They just found a list of 17. It could be random. 3, reasonable number. 17, something's going to come out. But each of them found some number of differences in the areas that they hypothesized. I came at this, again, 3 of us were working completely independently, even though the German teams are now unified to working together. I came in, as I say, atheoretical. If I had a bias, it was towards the temporal lobe, but nothing specific. I also, because I had a much, much larger sample than they did, I could look at the entire brain in a statistically valid way and just say, brain, you tell me what in the two groups are different. I had the statistical power to explore this appropriately because I had quadruple their sample sizes. And this is what happened. Specifically, I had 65 in total, which I think until last year was the largest sample of pedos undergoing MRI in general. And I compared them, again, very carefully selected. I purposefully did not compare them to healthy controls because I had pedophilic sex offenders. If they differed from healthy controls, I wouldn't know if it's because they're pedophilic or because they were willing to break the law. So I used other people who broke the law. Most of them were property offenders, but they were willing to break the law. So anything that would be different between my pedophilic sex offenders and my non-sexual offenders, nothing can easily or rationally be attributed to the offense propensity. So really, pedophilia is the remaining logical thing to attribute any detectable difference. These rule-outs were the same one. Person had to be 18. Person had to be able to, like I said before with the open MRIs, person had to physically be able to fit in the bore, it's called, the opening that the person goes into. No history of traumatic brain injury, because that would just, screw up the scan if we just have a big blotch. Couldn't have a history of schizophrenia. Schizophrenic brains look awful on an MRI. There's enormous general atrophy to it, and it's just, there's not a lot you can do with it. Although it does make, it often makes one more, sensitive isn't the word, sympathetic towards looking at that picture, and you think, that poor person. It also makes you wonder, look at, how atrophied the brain is, and schizophrenia is the only thing they have? And that we can kind of control. It amazes me when you look at these pictures where, you ever see a picture of a healthy lung and smoker lung? Right? It's like looking at those two pictures and you look at the smoker lung and that it ever worked. Same with the brain. You look at some of these schizophrenic brains and you think that it functions as well as it does is amazing. So these were my subjects. They matched on age, they matched on IQ, education. They differed in alcohol use. The CAGE is an alcohol screening inventory. Now, because my controls were non-sexual offenders, mostly property offenders, a lot of them did come from histories of alcohol trouble. But because alcohol, I'm pretty well convinced, does not cause brain growth, I thought it was pretty okay to continue with, I wouldn't accidentally, I wouldn't end up accidentally attributing alcohol-related, brain atrophy to the pedophiles, since it was the other group who had the excess alcohol. And percent non-right-handed, again, one almost double the other. These are the technicalities for if there are any MRI gurus in the audience.